Good afternoon. Good afternoon and most welcome to this conference on bioethics to celebrate that SMER, the Swedish Council of Medical Ethics, now turns 30. A very special welcome to our international guests. We have, let's see, how many nations do we have represented? Something like 14 nations represented here in the audience. So welcome to Sweden to you. It may be of interest to you to know that we are now in the midst of the Swedish government quarters, and the Prime Minister's office is in this very block, Rosenbad. Another special welcome to the many former members of SMER that are present here today and who have contributed to the progress of SMER over the last 30 years. And a third special welcome to you all. We hope that this will, you will find that these days will be rewarding, that they will be stimulating, interesting, provoking new thoughts. Gabriel Wikström, the Swedish Minister of Health, Public Health and Sport, was to greet you here, but he had to join a Swedish delegation to South Korea, so he can't be with us. But he has sent us his greetings. And now we'll see if we can have a look at his video.
Hello, and a warm welcome to Sweden, to Stockholm and to Rosenbad. I'm really sorry that I can't be with you. This conference and your part in the discussions here are part of a key global debate and come at a key time in human history. In every aspect of our lives, human ingenuity and our racing technologies mean that more than ever before, if only we could, has become, oh yes, we can. For us as individuals, as institutions, as societies, and as the human race. This is hugely exciting, liberating, and empowering. But it also means the second oldest question and challenge of being human is also greater than ever before. The question, okay, I know I could do this, but should I or should I not? Technology means these choices are now not only reaching more and more of us, but do and will continue to directly affect us all. And as Matthew Porteous, a pioneer in genetic editing, has pointed out, research that needed a sophisticated molecular laboratory 3 years ago can now be done by a high school student. Of course, choosing between what to do, smart or foolish, right or wrong, has always been as much a part of our humanity as our genes, and perhaps even more. Medical ethics has a long history of ever-widening debate from Hippocrates through Al-Ruhawi's practical ethics to modern bioethics today. Ethics which have always greatly determined the course of people's lives. But now, at the beginning of the 21st century, and as this new age is being born, ethics stand on the brink of helping determine the course of human life itself. So I'm sure you all know the stakes and the need for a truly informed debate have never been greater. I am, of course, no doctor, nor a scientist, but as all you doctors and scientists know of politicians, real power brings real choices, for good or for bad, for others. Real power brings real consequences. The responsibility it brings is very real too. History teaches us no greater lesson. So as much as your experience and expertise, we now need as never before the insight, wisdom, and sense of humanity you bring to this conference and share with your colleagues to help inform this great global debate. to help us all work together and with greater understanding to do what is right for all our futures. So welcome once again. I wish you all a great 2 days and every one of you all the very best. Thank you.
I realized that this video was taken just around the corner here. Tonight, the Minister's Secretary of State, Agneta Karlsson, will join us for dinner, so some of you will have the opportunity to meet her. Now, we don't have a logo or a slogan for our anniversary, but I went to the web to find an appropriate picture. And they're plentiful. I guess that all of these apply to SMER. 30 years with gratitude, yes, we are grateful. 30 years together, we are together. This is the happiness years. 30 years of changing lives, 30 years of excellence. Everything can be applied to SMER, I guess. 30 years at the top, 30 years of quality, trust, and experience. And considering our budget, we can even claim that we, like Ryanair down there, have 30 years of low fares. And it's not interesting to see we are just as old as Ryanair and the cochlear implant. And just one reflection on this. The only motto that seems to be missing among us 30 years olds is modesty. This is missing. So once you're out on the web, you simply cannot stop. So I soon went into the chronicles and the blogs and the discussion what it is like to be 30, to turn 30. And what struck me the most, a common theme there was the narcissism of everyone. Now, the basic idea of this conference has been to avoid narcissism as far as possible. We are extremely pleased to have so many distinguished international and national speakers, chairs, discussants on the program. Those of you who are in the audience and may not have been very active in the international arena of bioethics should know that you will, during these days, have an opportunity to meet some of the leading experts in the field. So how to further avoid narcissism? As you may see from the program, one approach has been to have a broad time perspective covering not only 30 years of experience or 30 years that have passed, but also many of the critical bioethical questions of today and tomorrow. Hindsight and foresight. Another approach is to have a very broad geographical perspective, national, European, global. SMER is, as far as we know, the second oldest national ethics council in Europe. We will this afternoon hear from France, you have the oldest one in Europe, and from the Danish Ethics Council, which is approaching 30 years, 28 or something, I think. And yet another approach to avoid narcissism is to have a mix of, shall we say, eternal ethics issues like those in the beginning and the end of life, and new challenges that bioethics are facing today. 3 persons have been very actively involved in the program committee, and I want to thank them especially. Lotta Eriksson, please rise. Lotta is head of the secretariat and have been the main coordinator of this conference. And we have Nils-Erik Salin. Where are you? Up there. Philosopher, bioethicist, member of SMER, and Katrin Paulsson Ahlgren, also a member of SMER. And in our small but very efficient secretariat, Karin Wilby-Ramsay and Robert Kreer have been very active and contributed very considerably to the preparations of this program. So, Karin and Robert, where are you? Karin, there. And Robert, somewhere. Okay. So once again, most welcome to you all. Let's begin. And first I have the pleasure of introducing Professor John Harris. He will give his perspective on what bioethics was and what it will be. John Harris is Professor of Ethics at the University of Manchester and Director of the Institute for Science, Ethics and Innovation at the university. He's a key person not only in the academic world, but also in international bodies that deal with bioethics, like WHO and the European Union. And he is very active in the public debate on bioethics. And I have sometimes used a quote from John Harris that has a special appeal to me. We must be science's masters, not at its mercy. So please, John.
Thank you very much for that. Just checking that my mic is working. Thank you very much for that very warm welcome. It's both a great honor and a great privilege to be here at this meeting, a meeting that is both important, I think, scientifically and in policy terms, but also a great celebration of the work that has gone on throughout Europe in the past 30+ years. And, of course, it's been a wonderful welcome to this beautiful city. I've never seen it looking so beautiful. It's such a pleasure to be back here. I was listening carefully to the minister's introduction, and it put me in mind of a not often quoted remark by the great Marcus Aurelius in his Meditations, where he talked about the job of a ruler. And he said, the job of a ruler, to do good and be damned. And I hope that's what bioethics committees of whatever size or description think they should do. The history of modern bioethics started 37 years ago on the 25th of July, 1978, a little before the time window that I was given to talk about. That date marks the beginning of a now, I believe, irreversible shift, both in public interest and in professional study, of the ethical issues raised by medicine, science and technology as applied to humans. This is a shift away from patient and procedure-centered medical ethics to a science, technology, and policy-centered bioethics, focused on citizens and society, not on patients and their rights and welfare. I think this shift is irreversible, and that for all theoretical but not practical purposes, medical ethics is dead. Now, I'm very fond of qualifying the definition of death when I talk about organ transplants and so forth, bearing in mind that there is no watertight definition of death, and that I usually recommend the phrase dead enough. So what we need to know is not, is the organ donor dead, but are they dead enough to be a donor? So I'm not saying that medical ethics is beyond a peradventure dead, but dead enough. Now, this shift that I want to illustrate in a moment, I believe is exemplified by two current debates, in both of which I've been involved from the very beginning, way back in 1978. One is the emergence of all forms of human enhancement, whether medically focused or not, as a locus of concern and a subject of study. The second centers on a range of issues broadly characterized by their impact on our understanding of human reproduction and genetic inheritance. Advances in medical and other sciences are forcing policy considerations for which many of us are neither ready nor well-informed enough to react. Rapid progress by scientists in developing germline and genome editing technologies, for example, have the potential to transform the treatment of genetic conditions in two ways that I'm going to expand on further. First, by so-called gene editing, rewriting the DNA code of affected cells or inserting new cells, synthetic or natural, into the genome. And secondly, I'll say less about this, but it's, I think, very important, the emergence of epigenetics as a source of heritable changes has prompted debates on the ethics of genetically modifying human embryos and other tissues to prevent serious diseases. In this talk, I'm going to concentrate on human reproduction and genetic inheritance, although, of course, these issues are also dimensions, as I believe is all medicine and most technology, of a concern with human survival and enhancement, and I'll come back to human survival right at the end of my talk. I see this shift as both occasioned by and crystallized on the birth of two British girls, the birth of both of whom was made possible by British science. And please forgive the apparent chauvinism of that claim, but look, you've got to tell it like it is. And as it happens, British science was involved in both cases. The first, of course, was the birth of Louise Brown on the date that I started with in 1978. And she, I believe, started the modern versions of this debate. In a paper I published in 1983 on in vitro fertilization, I also incidentally described the technique that would eventually produce a live cloned creature. And I went on to discuss some possible advantages of human cloning in my book, The Value of Life, which was published in 1985. However, the defining event was, of course, the birth of another instantly famous female baby, announced in Nature on February the 27th, 1997. This baby, named Dolly, allegedly because she had been cloned from the mammary gland of a sheep, which had instantly reminded those responsible for her birth of Dolly Parton. I can't think why. Louise and Dolly proved to be healthy and, as far as is publicly known, happy individuals who, like the over 5 million babies born since Louise Brown, owe their existence to the work of Bob Edwards and Patrick Steptoe, both of whom I'm very proud to say I knew personally. We may hope that a very large proportion of these IVF children are glad to be alive and glad their births were not prevented by the suppression of the science that made them possible. I'll say more about this in a moment. Louise Brown and Dolly the sheep are related also by something else, by the unfortunate prejudice against them of those who objected and indeed continue to object to the birth of each of them. This prejudice was unfortunately fostered by the activities of a number of national and international ethics committees, notably that of UNESCO. It's hard, I know, to be on a national ethics committee. So I do sympathize with you. And indeed, I've been on a few. As you know, Britain was only not the first national ethics committee to exist because we've never had one. And with apologies to the Nuffield Council, I'm very pleased to say still do not have a national ethics committee. But I was a member of very many of our quasi-national ethics committees, the Human Genetics Commission, the Advisory Committee on Genetic Testing, and a number of others. So I have shared a lot of the public responsibility that you share for decisions that I didn't entirely approve of, but was involved in making. As we meet here, two genetic technologies capable of making heritable changes to the human genome have revived interest in, and in some quarters a very familiar panic concerning, so-called germline interventions. These technologies are most recently the use of CRISPR-Cas9 to edit genes in IVF zygotes, and of course, mitochondrial replacement therapy, MRT, the use of which was approved in principle in a landmark vote earlier this year by the United Kingdom Parliament. The possibility of using either of these techniques in humans has encountered the most violent hostility and suspicion. However, it's important to be aware that much of this hostility, I believe, dates back to the fears associated with IVF and other reproductive technologies, and by fears associated with cloning. And I want to suggest to you that the use of both of these technologies have proved highly beneficial to humanity, and indeed have also proved to have been susceptible to effective regulation. The form of the prejudice that I've been speaking of, and that engages us in the debate over germline modification, was articulated by the UNESCO Bioethics Committee to justify their condemnation of cloning. And this resulted, as many of you will know, in UNESCO publishing their, I believe, infamous Universal Declaration on the Human Genome and Human Rights in 1997, which absurdly endorses, quote, the preservation of the human genome as the common heritage of humanity, end quote. Now, those who appeal to the common heritage of humanity in this way have also come to see the present evolved state of the human genome not only as the common heritage of humanity, but as involving the almost always unargued assertion that the human genome must be, as it were, frozen as far as is possible in perpetuity at this particular evolutionary stage. UNESCO, and many before and since, conveniently ignore the fact that cloning is the only reproductive method that actually does preserve the human genome. All others randomly vary it. So really, if one was serious about it, and certainly if UNESCO were to be serious, they would vote for human cloning as the only permitted reproductive method. And I'm not suggesting that. Other forms of reproduction, as we know, randomly vary the human genome with each combination of the genetic material of two or more, as we now can do in different individuals. What human reproduction does not do very well is improve the human genome. As I argued in my last book, Enhancing Evolution, the human genome in its present state is a very imperfect work in progress. The problem is that progress via Darwinian evolution is extremely slow and the direction unpredictable, save only that it will facilitate gene survival. We surely need to accelerate the development of better resistance to bacteria, disease, viruses, or hostile environments, or of the technologies that will be eventually necessary to find and travel to habitats alternative to the Earth. And I'll return to that point in my closing few remarks. I just want to now look at some of the objections to germline interventions per se. Many of these objections emphasize that interventions differ in affecting generations, that such interventions differ from all others in affecting generations down the line. In other words, it's the effect and the unpredictability of the effect on future generations that many people fear. But we must remember that this is not only true of all assisted reproductive technologies, but of all reproduction of whatever kind. This so-called uncharted territory involves, of course, trade-offs between benefits to people now and concerns about future generations. But the introduction of all new technologies involves uncertainty about long-term and unforeseen events. And this is, of course, true of so-called normal sexual reproduction, a very dangerous activity indeed, and one often described as a genetic lottery. Just let me remind you of how jolly dangerous human reproduction is. Quote, every year, an estimated 7.9 million children 6% of the total birth rate worldwide, are born with a serious birth defect of genetic or partially genetic origin. Additional hundreds of thousands more are born with serious birth defects of post-conception origin, including maternal exposure to environmental agents, teratogens such as alcohol, rubella, syphilis, and iodine deficiency that can harm the developing fetus. Sexual reproduction, with its gross inefficiency in terms of the death and destruction of embryos, estimated to be 1 in 3 to 1 in 5 deaths for every live embryo that comes to term, involves significant harm to future generations, but has not usually been objected to on those grounds. Indeed, I venture to suggest that had sexual reproduction been invented as a technology rather than found as part of our evolved biology, it would never have been licensed. None of you guys would ever have approved it with that malformation rate and that death rate. Far too dangerous to be permitted. And interestingly, if we take, as is very likely, the deficiencies of sexual reproduction as the gold standard, then we might be forced to be tolerant of quite a lot of danger in other forms of reproduction and in other methods of interfering with inheritance. In a recent statement on NIH, National Institutes of Health in the US, funding of research using gene editing technologies in human embryos, issued officially by NIH, Francis S. Collins, MD, PhD, director of NIH, stated this: "The strong arguments against engaging in this activity remain. These include the serious and unquantifiable safety issues, ethical issues presented by altering the germline in a way that affects the next generation without their consent." End quote. Serious and unquantifiable safety issues feature in all new technologies. So what's special about germline technologies? And I just want to deal with this issue of consent because I think it's very important and it occurs in all the objections to uses of CRISPR and to MRT. And summoning up as much respect for Francis S. Collins as is possible for an ape-descended creature like myself, consent is simply irrelevant here, for the simple and sufficient reason that there are no relevant people in existence capable of either giving or withholding relevant consents. You can't consult the unborn as to what they would have consented to. George Bernard Shaw and Isadora Duncan were famous, but only partial and possibly apocryphal exceptions, when she apparently said to him, "Why don't we make a baby? With your brains and my looks, how could it fail?" And his rather sober response you will be familiar with, "Yes, but what if it had your brains and my looks?" And just to put the tin lid on the consent issue, I'm a baby boomer. I was born in 1945. Why was I and all the other baby boomers born in 1945? Well, for various reasons, but in my case, it's because my Jewish parents in the United Kingdom wanted to wait until Hitler was, if ever, safely out of the way before they risked having another child, because they didn't think a world dominated by the Nazis would be a fit place for a child to come into existence. My sister had been born in 1937, and they waited. And I'm here. Aren't you all pleased? Aren't you all grateful? Of course you are. But the point, of course, is that they could not have postulated what my consent to that decision about the future of an unborn child will be. They had to do something else. They had to think about what would be in the best interests of whatever the next child they had would be. Now, of course, I'm jolly grateful for the war and all that misery because I wouldn't have been here without it. No, of course I'm not. But of course that indicates the absurdity of Collins' point. If there is a discernible duty here, it is surely to create the best possible child. That is what it is to act for the best, all things considered. I want to mention one further possibility that I mentioned very briefly at the start, and that I believe has entirely escaped the attention of bioethics so far. And it is the fact that heritable changes are not necessarily confined to conventional germline genetic effects. As noted recently, and I quote, "The transmission of epigenetic states across cell divisions in somatic tissues is now well accepted, and the mechanisms are starting to be unveiled. The extent to which epigenetic inheritance can occur across generations is less clear," end quote. Now, assuming, as many believe, that epigenetics is now reasonably well established, although we don't know precisely the extent of the heritability of genetic changes, it's pretty clear that they are. Now, if UNESCO today, or their bioethics committee, or any other bioethics committee, wanted to adhere to the line that the germline was sacrosanct and no interventions in it could be countenanced because of their uncertainty and heritability, then we have to ask, what should we try to do about epigenetics? Because actually, we don't yet know what the mechanisms are. It will be very difficult, possibly impossible forever, but certainly very difficult for the foreseeable future to, as it were, police the mechanisms by which epigenetic changes occur. What price the sanctity of the germline then? As I say a bit of advertising here, sorry, I couldn't resist. As I say, my new book, which is going to be called How to Be Good, published by Oxford not until the spring next year, April. I called it How to Be Good because I hoped that people would mistake it for a self-help volume and that it would consequently sell in its millions, but I don't think it's very likely. But in that book, I issue a reminder that I'm very fond of, and that is that in the future, there will be no more human beings and no more planet Earth. That is as certain as any truths about the future can possibly be. Why will there be no more humans? Because either we will have further evolved or we will have died out. There will be no more planet Earth for more familiar reasons. By the time we have either evolved or there is no more planet Earth, we may hope that our better evolved successors will have developed the science and the technology needed to survive and to enable us, them, to find and colonize another planet, or perhaps other planets, or indeed even to have the technology to build another planet on which to live. And in the meanwhile, to cope better with the problems presented by living on this planet. Most importantly, perhaps, the problem of how to be good, or how to be good enough to ensure the survival of what we may be, which is the only sorts of beings anywhere in the universe capable of caring about their own survival or the survival of anyone else. Stephen Hawking initially predicted that we might have about 7.6 billion years to go before the Earth gives up on us. But he recently revised his position in relation to the Earth's continuing habitability as opposed to its physical survival, saying, quote, "We must also continue to go into space for the future of humanity. I don't think we will survive another 1,000 years without escaping beyond our fragile planet." Well, we will at some point have to escape, both beyond our fragile planet and beyond our fragile nature. This places a heavy responsibility on national and international ethics, medical ethics and bioethics committees, among others, to be mindful of the fact that in science lies our hope for the future. As I argued in my book, Enhancing Evolution, a few years ago, we need science in order that we and our successors will have a chance to survive to experience any future at all. Talk of, for example, moratoria on science, invoked in the name of precaution and safety, may in fact be inimical to safety. And unless we're sure in which direction safety lies, it seems to me we shouldn't talk of such things. I myself don't believe there are adequate reasons not to proceed with research, and also certainly with therapy involving MRT and research on CRISPR as a technology and other germline modification technologies, to the point where we can properly assess their likely safety in humans. And finally, we need the better to understand epigenetics so that we can both understand and harness methods available or that might become available to make the world a better place and humanity a better class of individuals for as long as humanity lasts. The better able to preserve one another, each other, and the better able to preserve our world as long as we can, and to find new worlds to support us and our successor individuals. So my message is we are really at a crossroads now, and we're at a crossroads at the moment where I think the precautionary principle, such as it is, and it's not a principle I have great respect for, but has, as it were, got out of hand. It is proving dangerous. It is perhaps a truism now that we humans started by being an endangered species, but have now become an endangering species. That is true, and science is partially responsible for that. But the only way that we can also cope with the endangering effects of our progress so far, global climate change, global warming, and so on, is also through science. Science has been part of the problem, but it needs to be part of the solution. I believe that it is your responsibility as members of ethics committees, which fortunately for me I am not, but all of our responsibilities as citizens, to try to ensure that there will be a future, as I say, for what may be the only creatures in the universe anywhere capable of worrying about other creatures and about the survival of creatures who value their own existence, which I take to be the defining characteristic of humans. We are creatures capable of valuing our own existence and hence, of course, valuing the existence of others. That is a big responsibility. And I believe it involves more caution with respect to invoking the precautionary principle. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And we now have a rather good time for discussions. There is really plenty to discuss because you have covered such a broad scope. Who wants to start? Nils Lyne. We have microphones, so you have to wait for the microphones.
It's axiomatic that I must be wrong, so the name of the game now is just to point out the many ways in which that must be true.
Well, okay, my name is Nils Lyne, and I would like to thank you for a very interesting talk. And if I'm summarizing what you are telling us, indirectly at least, you will suggest that this kind of national ethical councils might be impeding medical progress, medical scientific progress, more than they will close doors, not open doors. Would we be better off not having such national boards?
Far be it from me to give a definite answer to that question. I have to say that I've never been in favor of national ethics committees as, so to speak, as a set of institutions. Not because they're not well-meaning, not because they don't have well-qualified people on them, but because their tendency is naturally conservative. And that's become less true. I mean, I can remember the time when no National Ethics Committee could exist without half a dozen bishops on it, for example. But that has, by and large, changed. But I think you have to ask yourselves, as I try to ask myself, what good are you? What good are you? And I often, in my own case, say, well, not a lot. Not a lot. I sit in my office and I write papers that I find fun to write, and some of those papers annoy people that I find it fun to annoy. But I hope I'm reasonably sensible of the limited amount of good that, as it were, being a bioethicist rather than being a bioethics committee member does. I think the most good we can do is to try to influence, as it were, public affairs by intervening in the public debate. For example, I mean, a very good example, I think, is the recent history of the mitochondrial replacement therapy, the MRT debate in the United Kingdom, where really what did the job was individual and collective contributions to a really vigorous and well-informed public debate on the issue, where the result was really in doubt right until the last minute. We didn't know how Parliament was going to vote. I think our Parliament voted the right way. But even if I had not thought that, the outcome, the change, or the alternative to that change, which would have been business as usual, was what mattered. So I think the fostering of mechanisms for fostering a better informed public debate. And of course, that's part of what ethics committees do. They write reports, they analyze the evidence and so forth, and they put them in the public domain. That's part of what you do. But if you ask me what's the most useful thing I've done in the last 2 or 3 years, it was speak in Parliament on the evening before the MRT debate to an audience which included quite a few MPs. It was a debate with the other side. We had a very vigorous debate. There were about something like 20 or 30 MPs passing through that debate, and a number of other stakeholders and members of the public. And the debate included the people from Newcastle who developed the MRT methodologies and their opponents. I think we need much more outreach, much more involvement in public debate on the sorts of issues that make a difference, and much less sitting in closed rooms. Difficult to do, difficult to organize how to do it, I recognize, but that will be my answer.
Can you just clarify, in many countries, the national ethics committees have both research ethics and, shall we say, the implementation, what comes after the research. Your skepticism, does that include both?
Yes, but for different reasons. I think research ethics committees, by and large, are much worse even than ethics committees, because they are, well, it depends at which level we're talking. Of course, there are many different types of research committees. There are those committees in institutions that look at research protocols and so on. That's one sort of type of research committee, and then there are the sort of rather grandiose, overarching committees that look at the ethics of research. But I think both of those actually are, if I may say so, of dubious utility. Now, I think the utility comes in writing well-informed reports, balancing the pros and cons of, for example, particular technologies or particular policy choices. But then that's only the beginning. What one then needs to do is to have mechanisms for, either within these committees or indeed elsewhere in society, for ensuring that those reports then become part of the public debate, so that by the time a legislature is looking at what to do, there is a well-informed public debate. Now, I was being rather chauvinistic about Britain in the past. I think we've done that pretty well with lots of caveats. And if you take something like the Human Fertilization and Embryology Authority, I have been a serial critic of almost every decision they've ever taken. But I'm pleased we have the HFEA. Why? Because we have a regulatory body to which decisions in detail and particular cases can be referred, and to which the first proposed use of MRT will be referred. And though I've always criticized them for being far too conservative, wouldn't I just? Nonetheless, I'm very pleased we have the HFEA. It is a hugely valuable public institution. I think it's often wrong, but then I think governments are often wrong. That's democracy. That's democracy. It's not an argument against governments. What I do think we need, though, are bodies other than a parliament, which is incredibly unwieldy, or a legislature, to take more immediate case-by-case decisions. And that's one of the things in the particular field of human reproduction that the HFEA can do. And we need other such bodies in other fields, it seems to me.
Thank you. Medicinsk-etiska Salim.
I don't know if Baruch Fischoff arrived yet, but he's a psychologist, and people like Baruch Fischoff and others have taught me something which I think is, at least to me, very important. And that is that we as human beings are short-sighted, one-eyed, and prone to a serious problem of refraction when it comes to rationality and decision-making. We are extremely irrational. And when I listen to you, you want us, this bunch of irrational people, to take decisions about human mankind. You trust us more than evolution. And to me, it seems as there is a slight problem there. And I don't say that you are guilty of it, but there's a tendency of philosophical arrogance or hubris in that type of argument. And then when it comes to the precautionary principle, I fully agree with you that it is problematic. But does that mean that we should not reflect on the new techniques and think about what we want to do with them? Because if we use CRISP, will we develop good people, people who love and care, or will we make ourselves more rational? Will we move in the direction that C.S. Lewis point at in The Abolition of Man? Sort of a bunch of questions, but okay.
Well, a very interesting and daunting set of questions. Evolution doesn't make decisions, so it's not a question of whether we make decisions better or worse than evolution. Unfortunately or fortunately, evolution is not in the deciding business. But it is our fate as humans, or at least as human agents, and not all humans are agents, but as human agents, to be decision makers. And it is also our fate to understand not only that we can make good or bad choices of what to do, but that we can make good or bad choices about what not to do or what to postpone. There's a wonderful phrase, actually, that comes from the field of criminal justice, and it is that justice delayed is justice denied. Well, therapy delayed is also therapy denied, and change for the better delayed is also change for the better denied. So we have a tightrope to walk. We can't decide not to decide, because that's a form of decision, and B, because it's no more secure, it's no more likely to be the right choice. So it's our fate to choose. We're stuck with it, basically. And it will be the fate of our successors if we are lucky enough for our evolution to go on long enough for us to have successors. That same fate will be theirs. So there's no avoiding that. I'm not saying that we will We will always make the right choices, but I hope we will do is always make the choices that, on the best combination of evidence and argument, seem to be the right choices. Now, my new book that I mentioned, I was rather mealy-mouthed about what it's about. Actually, it's about moral enhancement. It's about the scientific endeavor to make people better in the good and bad sense of better. And I'm skeptical about it, and I have been called an apostate and a renegade because I've, over my career, by and large, championed human enhancement in many, many forms. Cognitive enhancement, physical enhancement, health enhancement, longevity. I see no prospect in moral enhancement because none of the proposed methodologies are at all well calculated to make an improvement in our, as it were, in our moral behavior. And the reason for that is that I believe morality is a cognitive business. In other words, to act for the best is to act for the best, all things considered. And it inevitably involves the consideration not of all things, that's impossible, but of many of the relevant things as we can. And so actually my conclusion to this book, to save you the trouble of buying it, is that if we are to take the idea of moral enhancement seriously, then it had better be cognitive enhancement, because that is which includes, of course, as it were, the mechanisms which enable science, because that's our best prospect. Not an infallible prospect, but I think it's our best prospect.
Thank you. Finn Bengtsson.
Thank you very much for your excellent exposure of this problem. I find that your main criticism of institutions for ethics should be that they could be too conservative. Very interesting. Now, I happen to be a conservative politician, but that has nothing to do with this. Rather, my question is that many of the institutions that we have to surveil different aspects of public life, the outmost watchdogs of these institutions, let's say for integrity, are by virtue of their existence very conservative, to be the last stop, so to say. For example, the Department of Finance is among all the departments the most conservative regarding public economic expenditure. It comes with the nature of that resistance. So my question is that I greatly respect your view on institutions on ethics, not to be there, to be this conservative stop for possible development. But on the same token, would you think that other institutions that are politically advising politicians, like, for example, institutions of integrity, also should not be there because they are hindering a development of the integrity aspect in a very conservative way?
The short way of answering your question, look, I'm a Democrat. The people must decide. So I have very firm views about very often about what the right way for them to decide would be. But sometimes people say to me, but who are you to say what we should do? And my answer to that is, well, I'm not anybody to say what should be done. That in democracies, which fortunately I think all of us in this room probably live in one sort of democracy or another, just about, that's for the democracy. What I think we should encourage is not necessarily less conservatism or more conservatism, but better informed debate, so that when democracies do decide, they decide, as I indicated I try to do, on the best combination available of evidence and argument. Now, and when they do, I'm a Democrat, and of course I accept the decisions. I may regret them, but I accept them. And in a way, democracy is, I think, a sufficient break on things. Democracies tend to be conservative. You're lucky that you're a conservative politician, because in my experience, the people, by and large, certainly in European societies, tend on the whole to be conservative, whether they call themselves socialist or not. They tend to be conservative, particularly about science. So I don't think we're in great danger of running, the horse running away with the cart. But what I do think we all need to think about, and perhaps that would be a very good agenda item for all national ethics committees, would be how to ensure a better and better informed public debate on the sorts of issues that come before you as committee members. I'm sure you're doing that, by the way. I don't think you're not worried about that, but still, I think it's an important thing.
Thank you. Thanks. I agree totally with the last word you said, maybe not with most of what you said before. Because as a scientist, or I used to be a scientist, actually I know pretty well this milieu, and I would be scared of a world where the decision would be made on the advice of only scientists, and worst of all, by technologists. Because technologists run so fast that they find that the scientists are really hindering progress, because they want to keep control of the technology. And technology wants to get rid of this control by scientists. And scientists want to get rid of control by so-called ethicists. I don't know what it is, but anyway, it's a word. So how can we give something to think to the people and to inform the people? I think that one of the most rewarding tasks of ethics committees, and I think my chair will be okay with me to say that it's the goal of the French committee, is really to feed the public debate and try to make statements sometimes which will help people to think about the issues that science and technology have brought into the public. Not debate, because the debate is very, very difficult, as you said, to establish. But if nobody does this job, I mean, if we keep on with only the point of view of scientists and technologists, then I'm really scared about our future, and I am old enough to be, well, safe for myself, but not for my children, my grandchildren. So it's really a matter of equilibrium, of balance between one type of thought and another type of thought, and scientists cannot do the job. That's clearly my belief after 40 years of doing science.
A very challenging question, but please be short.
I will try and be short. I mean, I don't dissent from that, except to say what committees like yours and individual scientists, and I count as, I'm not a scientist, I'm a philosopher, but I count as a scientist for these purposes. I've been principal scientist on a lot of funded projects. It's just a term we use for somebody intervening in a particular scientific type of debate. But it is not in my experience, actually, it's not the scientists. I mean, if you take the MRT debate, I think our parliament was very influenced by the women with mitochondrial disease who got up and explained their predicament, that they wanted genetically related children. And they actually dissolved a common fallacy, or helped to dissolve it, which was, I think, made by many people looking at the problem from the outside. They reminded us that we're not choosing between a germline intervention, which might have disastrous consequences down the way. The failure to permit that therapy does not stop deleterious effects getting into the germline. Why? Because these women will have children, even if they can't have the therapy. And they will pass on mitochondrial disease in the germline, absent a therapy that they can use. And I think one of the very important facts that came home in the debate in the UK, and I hope it will come home in the debate in the UK, because just after our debate in Parliament, I was invited to Washington and took part in a debate at the NIH, in which three very eloquent women affected by mitochondrial disease spoke, and they made it very clear to all who were there that it was not a choice between do we intervene in the germline or not. The germline will be affected. The only question on the table is, will it be affected by mitochondrial disease, because people will go on having the children the genetically related children that they passionately desire, or will they have access to a therapy? And so we're not saying perfectly safe germline, damaged germline. We're comparing the introduction of technology which may have no deleterious effect. In fact, it's believed that it won't, and we hope it won't. No deleterious effect on the germline, as opposed to continuing with reproductive practices which we know will adversely affect the germline.
Thank you very much, John, for a very stimulating both presentation and stimulating discussion.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Then I'll hand over the chair to Siobhan O'Sullivan, who is Chief Bioethics Officer at the Department of Health in Dublin in Ireland. Siobhan has close Swedish connections, which is a particular pleasure. Thank you.
So, good afternoon, everybody. I'm really delighted to be here in Stockholm, and I want to thank SMER for the invitation. I'd first like to congratulate the committee on their 30th anniversary and the wonderful work that you've been doing during that period of time. I always hate to disagree with Shell, but on this occasion I'm going to have to, because I think as an Irish woman who has had the unfortunate experience of having to travel Ryanair quite a lot, I think that the analogy to SMER is not a good one at all. I think I speak on behalf of many of our international colleagues in the audience who have looked to SMER over the years for very reflective and really, really high quality opinions, which I think have influenced the work of very many other national ethics committees. So for that, thank you, congratulations, and I wish you all the best for your future work. I'd like to start this afternoon. We have the pleasure of having Professor Jean-Claude Amisson, Professor and Chair of the National Consultative Ethics Committee in France, who's going to address us. And Jean-Claude's presentation is Ethics and Society's Process of Free and Informed Choice, the first 32 years of an evolving approach. Jean-Claude.
Thank you very much. Thank you for this invitation, and happy 30th birthday and anniversary. We are 32 years old, so we are almost twins. And during these 32 years, one thing that has not changed regarding the committee is its composition. 40 members named by more than 15 different institutions, and with a minority of people named from the medical or biomedical research world, with the conviction that when the questions are not technical or scientific, but when the questions are regarding human respect and human rights, expertise is necessary, but is insufficient. And so that members should be beyond the field of medicine and of biology, biomedical research, in order to address these questions. What has greatly changed are the missions that the Parliament has given to our committee. The words first, which show, I think, changes through time. 32 years ago, the committee had as a mission to produce opinions on moral problems raised by research in biology, medicine, and health. 10 years, in 1994, when we had the first law pertaining to bioethics, the moral problems changed to ethical problems. So it's more, it shows the change from a view of a moral role to a view of participation in ethical reflection. 10 years later, with the second law relating to bioethics, the mission was to produce opinion on ethical problems and societal issues pertaining not so much only to research, but to advances in knowledge in the fields of biology, medicine, and health. And the biggest change came with the third law in 2011, where the Parliament said that if the law is to be changed in France, in a field which is in the field of the missions of the French committee, then the change of the law should be preceded by the organization by our committee of a public debate, the organization of a citizen conference on this topic, and a report that we write and we publish after this public debate and that we present to the Parliament. So the change for us began 2.5 years ago when the President of France announced that the law would be changed concerning end of life. And so we made, as usually, an opinion. And then we participated to the animation of the public debate. We organized a citizen conference. We wrote a report on 2 years of public debate. And there will now be, in the fall, a law project that will be voted. And so it has changed from giving our opinion on a question to participating to a public reflection on this question in the society. What has changed also in parallel is the scope of our reflection and opinions. The committee began with classical so-called bioethics questions, beginning of life, end of life, genetics, medical assisted procreation. And in the last 15, 20 years, it opened its scope to inequities in health and research between North and South, to health in prisons, to the way the rights of handicapped persons are not respected, to the use of biological data, biometry, in identity papers and human rights, and more recently on the relationship between us as humankind and the environment, the biodiversity, the climate, and more recently also questions about ethical problem raised by the introduction of new methods in education. So I think we are a committee since the beginning. We are a National Consultative Ethics Committee on life science and health. And the definition, as you know, by WHO of health extends to the classical notion of biomedical ethics or bioethics, because it's a physical, mental, and social well-being. And so I think that we have more and more included this dimension in our reflection. And I think when we go back to the big ethical revolutions that have happened since some time, there are always reaction to disasters. I mean, the Red Cross began after the massacre during the Battle of Solferino. Modern biomedical ethics was born with the Nuremberg Code in 1942. Doctors Without Borders was born during the Biafra genocide. And big changes came with a natural catastrophe not caused by human, which was AIDS pandemics, which saw the creation of patients' association, the notion that respect of human rights is part of a health approach and a medical approach, and with modification of laws regarding international laws regarding patent. So I think that these questions, when John Harris was speaking about the precaution principle, there is one view of the precaution principle that is not to think that science is bad, but to ask the question, who are we excluding? Who are we forgetting when we think about ethical questions? And when we know that 850 million people suffer from hunger in the world, and you were alluding to the suffering of children, 3 million children died of hunger last year. So the question is to include this problem, and maybe not to think that ethical reflection in these fields is only to think about, and it's very important, the advancement of knowledge with big data, neuroscience, genetics, gene editing, artificial intelligence, but also how do we use new knowledge, but sometimes even old knowledge, to address problems which maybe we get used to because they are not recent. And there is a tendency to react very strongly to new problems because they are changing our way of living, and to become accustomed to old inequities problem because they have been there for so long that nobody is looking at them. And we think we have several institutions devoted to human rights in France, as there is in the world. And we think that often we are working in parallel on similar problems, but we are working separately. And so I would like that we think together from a health, WHO view of health on our side, and from a human rights side, and see how much it intersects and can be helpful. The other thing that has changed, and I hope will continue to change, is a very big emphasis that had been put concerning the role of the committee on recommendations. The Parliament asked us from the beginning to recommend in our opinions if we thought it was useful. And society is waiting for recommendations. And I believe that, and we have begun to change, that our main role is not to substitute for the society, but to help society to make an informed and free choice about these problems. And I think free and informed consent is a pillar of modern biomedical ethics since the Nuremberg Code in 1947. And the strange thing is the term itself, free and informed consent, has something which is paternalistic, because the question was not about the right to consent. The big change was about the right to refuse. So it could have been called the process of free and informed refusal, and everybody would have asked, why do you presume people will refuse? Why do we presume people will consent? So I think it has begun slowly to be not even to say yes or no, but to reflect and to choose. And so it's a process of free and informed choice. And I think that this process, to enhance this process in society, might be the essential and most important role of our committee. There is a strange situation, or at least I find it strange, which is that in the field of what is called biomedical ethics, or ethics concerning health, since 32 years there has been the worldwide opinion that it's good to think that expertise is necessary but insufficient. And so an ethical committee in the world is legitimate only if it's independent and if it's open beyond expertise. This is for the biomedical field, which, by the way, is strange because medicine by vocation, if not by usual practice, is one of the rare human activity which has as a goal to help others. There are a lot of other activities which has not as a principal goal to help other people. And in this field, it's thought that beyond expertise, questions should be addressed pertaining to human rights and human respect. Now, in other fields which are very important and have a considerable impact on health, economic questions, environmental questions, nuclear questions, a lot of questions, our society delegates decisions to experts. And it would be very strange if financial or economical questions in Europe or in the world or in a country would be discussed by a panel containing economists and philosophers, anthropologists, and laypersons which participate to open the reflection. And so I think there is a kind of schizophrenia. Either we made a mistake in the field of biomedical ethics, and we should resort, as was the case 70 years ago, to doctors and scientists reflecting about what should be done, or we make mistakes in the other fields, in economy, in environment, and we should think of building similar kind of institutions that could broaden their reflection beyond expertise. And I think we should at least I try myself, help to develop this kind of institution, because I think that health problems are too broad for biomedical ethics committee to take them all in their hands. And we should facilitate or prone the development of such institution and work with them once they will be or they might be created. The French philosopher Paul Ricoeur said that one enters, really enters, I don't know how one enters in ethics, I don't know how one really enters into ethics, but he said that one really enters into ethics when, in addition to stating one's freedom, one stands the wish, the will, that the freedom of others be. I want you to be free, he added. And so I think that this is maybe at the heart of what we should do in our, and what we do in our ethical committees. And I think it's at the core of democracy. It's what democracy is about, as was said. Allowing free and informed choice with the respect of the rights of each human being. And I think that maybe one of the main roles of our committees should be to allow in our nations, in Europe and in the world, for a real and living democracy. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jean-Claude. I think we're going to take all three of our speakers, and then we'll have time for a very broad-ranging discussion. So our next speaker is well known to you all. It's Lotta Eriksson, who is head of the Secretariat of SMER, and she is going to talk to us about the 30 years of SMER and lessons for the future. Lotta.
Thank you, Yvonne. My name is Lotta Eriksson. I'm head of the Secretariat. I've been working for the Council for 14 years, 5 years head of the Secretariat. I must say I'm delighted to see so many friends, colleagues from other countries, former expert members of the Council, current members, representatives from authorities. Oh, it's really nice. I'm honored to give this presentation today. In this presentation, I will say something about how and why the Swedish Ethics Council was established, its tasks and organization, and then give examples of changes and developments over the years. Finally, I will refer to challenges and lessons for the future. It all started in 1984. Do you remember the 80s? Sweden won the European Song Contest. The Terminator was released. Well, the Prime Minister of Sweden was Olof Palme. At this time, there was an intensive debate concerning privacy and personal integrity in Sweden. In the beginning of 1984, a debate started that questioned the extended use of personal identification numbers. At the time, several important governmental committees investigated questions that raised new ethical questions and dilemmas. The right of the unborn child. The committee was appointed to make an inquiry concerning prenatal diagnosis and late abortions. The second committee investigated insemination, in vitro fertilization, and surrogacy. A key discussion in their report was the right for the child to get knowledge of its origin. There was also a genetic integrity committee appointed to inquire into ethical, humanitarian, and social issues arising from the use of genetic engineering. The main point of the inquiry concerned future use of techniques on humans. Finally, a committee was assigned to evaluate whether Sweden should change its criteria for death. The main purpose to make changes was to be able to perform heart transplants. All these questions were heavily discussed in the media at the time. Several members of parliament had also made requests in the parliament on questions arising from advances in biomedicine. These requests was also to be prepared. In the light of this debate, and considering that the Committee on Health and Welfare was soon to receive law proposals on these questions, a hearing was arranged in the Parliament. It gathered 30 experts from different authorities and organizations to discuss the topics mentioned before and the need of in-depth ethical analysis. Two of the experts are present here today, Barbro Westerholm and Kerstin Hagenfeldt. The conclusions of the hearing was that members of the Parliament saw a need for a committee for in-depth analysis to get an overview and follow-up on ethical issues raised by scientific and technological advances in biomedicine. They also pointed out that they, as politicians, needed information at an early stage, not when a new medical method were already in use or to be introduced. And the professional present expressed a need for ethical guidance and recommendations from stakeholders. In November, the Swedish Parliament made a decision and instructed the government to establish an ethics committee. In March 1985, the Council was established and had its first meeting already in May. Well, the Council is mainly an advisory body to the government and Parliament. The main task has remained the same since 1985. To identify and explore ethical issues raised by scientific and technological advances in biomedicine from a societal perspective, to serve as a body for exchange of knowledge and opinions on bioethics, and serve as a link between science, citizens, and political decision makers, to stimulate the public debate on bioethics. As Kjell already mentioned, the Swedish Ethics Council has quite a unique construction as compared to other countries, in that it consists of both professionals and politicians. I've understood that this model seems odd from an international perspective. The Council works in an old tradition in Sweden called parlamentariska utredningar, parliamentarian committees, that includes members from every political party in the parliament, and experts. To appoint such committee has been one way to prepare a law proposal and to get political backing. As we see it, Council decisions acquire a greater degree of democratic legitimacy if both experts and politicians are members, and it ensures that the Council's analysis and positions are anchored in the Swedish society. In this way, the Council also serves as a link between science stakeholders and the public. The Council's work process has changed over the years. At the moment, we have the following publications. We produce reports, a fast track called Smear Comments, where the Council comments publications from other ethics councils in Europe or the world, conference reports, consultation responses, and other opinions and letters. In the beginning of the Council's work, the main publications was a book series called Ethical Landmarks. These books were used mainly in the education of health professionals. The first one was called Ethics and Introduction. It was followed up by a book debating euthanasia. And another one, The Elusive Concept of Human Dignity, and another on the view of human beings, just to give some examples. Some of these publications are still in demand. Among the recurring topics, we see euthanasia, organ donation, prenatal diagnosis, big data, privacy question concerning registers, etc. Assisted reproduction comes up every second year, genetic integrity, and priority setting in healthcare. Recall that several of these issues were on the agenda already in 1984. Over the time, the Council has released an increasing number of publications and increased also the number of workshops and seminars. The Council used to be more of a think tank giving advice to the government and to the Parliament. It was a platform for exchange of information and deliberations. The Council made an impact, but not always in a directly visible way. So the Council has gone from discussion behind closed doors to be more visible in society. The Council's reports are nowadays widely debated in the media. We arrange numerous public events, workshops, seminars, conferences, and we make the events open for the public by web films like this event today. At the moment, the Council takes also an active part in the public debate, present in radio and television, opinion pieces in the press, etc. We are also more active participants in networks of the national ethics committees. Some of the recent examples: 2 weeks ago, the Swedish ethics councils met the Danish ethics councils in the south part of Skåne. All the members, or almost all the members, were present from each council, as well as secretariats. On the agenda was questions concerning quantified self and wearables, end-of-life decision-making, just to mention some examples. I think it was really fruitful discussions. Another example is we arranged a workshop on ethical aspects on reconstructive surgery for children with differences in sex developments in collaboration with Ritva Halila from Finland. And we also invited Joachim Wetter from the German Ethics Council to talk about their previous opinion on intersex. We have repeatedly invited NAFL Council, who have been here when we discussed mitochondrial replacement and when we discussed neurotechnologies. Challenges related to working procedures. This is just some examples. Priorities, timing, speed, and questions concerning ethical analysis and opinions. First, which is the optimal way to select among many current topics? Does the Council prioritize the right topics to deliberate? In the past, many of the discussions in the Council were interrupted without any opinion to conclude the discussions and deliberations. One way to address this problem was to introduce a more structured process of selecting among possible projects. This has improved the Council's work. There's a description of the criteria in this SMER strategy. You'll find it outside or in the web. It has been most useful. The Council has so far completed the projects that have been prioritized, but the question still remained: did the Council really prioritize the most pressing issues? How can the Council improve in picking the right ones? I believe that sometimes, as individuals as well as Council, we tend to prioritize topics that we like, are interested in, and have worked with in the past, and perhaps postpone more pressing and tricky new ones. Timing. Yes, when is the right time to analyze a question? It can certainly be too late, but can it really be too early? Speed. Sometimes issues are pressing. To speed up processes, the Council then is divided into working groups. This avoids lengthy plenary treatment at the cost of broad discussions. Analysis and opinions. The Council is a group of members with different views. The Council has a tradition of consensus decisions, but in some opinions or reports, divergent positions are presented. Both approaches have their advantages. Consensus opinions can have a greater impact and be useful in the decision-making process, while the divergent position can be a good starting point for discussions in society. Transparency and explicit arguments in the opinions are of importance either way. Lessons for the future. Selecting topics, improve the selecting processes even more, and to give high priority to topics that are ethically controversial and engage the public. And to balance between recurring topics and ethical challenges of advances in biotechnology. Ethical analysis, continued professional analysis, but also increased public involvement. International input, increased collaboration and exchange with national ethics committees would be fruitful. Visibility and impact. Key elements are fundamentally important and interesting topics, openness and active participation in the public debate. Thank you.
Thank you, Lotta. Our final speaker for this session this afternoon is Henrik Kjellgaard Jorgensen, and he is the project manager with the Danish Council of Ethics. Henrik is going to speak about ethics in time, the development of the Danish Council of Ethics approach over 28 years. Henrik.
Thank you. First of all, I want, of course, to congratulate on behalf of the Danish Council of Ethics, the Swedish councils, and I hope we will collaborate in the future. And we have, as you said, just had a meeting. It was a good meeting, so I hope that will continue. And I've been employed in the Secretariat of the Danish Council of Ethics for 14 years, as you've been in the Swedish. What I'm going to talk about is not the future. I'll go back in time. I'll go back to not to 1985, but to 89, where the Danish Council of Ethics began publishing texts on artificial insemination. And what I'm going to do is to show you some quotations from some of those texts. I've read those texts. That was quite interesting, because I wanted to see whether the way we discussed ethical questions in that time, well, if that reminds about what we are doing nowadays. And I think a big change has happened. And I will try to show you that by showing you some citations, and all of them are within the area of artificial insemination. I think, or I would rather say my hypothesis was that we have gone from a more social or societal perspective and into an individual perspective, and want to demonstrate that as a matter of fact, is at least to some degree the truth. But first of all, I'll just give you a short summary of the law in the Danish context concerning IVF. And I need my glasses then. In 1989, there were no law, there were no rules in that way, but there was a practice. Women younger than should be younger than 14 years to have IVF. You could not use donor sperm, and the couple should have a stable relationship, and they should have had that for at least 3 years. And then in 1997, we had a requirement instead that the woman should live in a marriage or partnership with the man. And we got an age limit at 45 years, and sperm or egg must come from the couple, so a sperm donor was allowed. And then in 2006, the relationship requirement was abolished, and then instead there was a possible assessment of fitness for parenthood. And in 2013, co-mothers in lesbian partnerships were recognized as at birth, and in 2014, persons having changed their legal gender identity gain access to artificial insemination. So you can see that the possibilities concerning family structure has changed so much in those years. Now, a biological mother can have a child which he is the legal father to at the same time. Because of the changes in, you couldn't see that, the changes in 2014. And in the old days, we could only have IVF if we were in traditional nuclear families. So that's just a very big change. I'm not going to say if it is a good change. I'm just want to say that we have had this change. Then if we go back to 87, I want to show you a quotation from one of the. This was just an empirical, some empirical data from the Siemens Bank, Kryos in Aarhus in Denmark. Most of their customers now who buy sperm directly from the Siemens Bank, they are single women. 72%, and you can see in the other end we have one-sex couples and same-sex couples and the heterosexual couples, but there was just small groups compared to the single women. So this is not so that there has not just been a change of law. There's been a change in the ways we have structures families in relation to IVF. A big change here too. And now I'll go back to, as I promised, to 87 and show you and read a quotation from that time. The ethical ideal on which any application of fertilization methods is based indicates that a couple, to the extent possible, should parent their own biological children. In this connection, it is important to be aware that the technical solution to childlessness are ambitious with regard to ideals of life. As mentioned, they may prevent some ways of life, single parents, homosexual couples, from being perceived as divergent. On the other hand, they could also strengthen the conception that the ultimate norm is biological parenthood in a nuclear family. From a socio-ethical point of view, it therefore ought to be a requirement that new fertilization techniques are not introduced as standard treatment without a prior public discussion of how such techniques will impact the formation of ideals in the area of partnership and parenthood. I think this quotation must sound strange to you today. I think there are two things to notice. First, that the whole ideal of state neutrality, government neutrality in relation to life forms, we have all learned that lesson that the government, the state should be neutral in relation to life forms. But here, life forms are one of the bases for evaluating the technologies. Another thing I think is interesting in this context is the idea of ideals and ideals that should go into the evaluation too of those technologies. And what is meant by ideals, I have an example of that. Also from 87, the possibility of fertilization of the human egg outside the female body has created a situation that is entirely new in the history of man. For the first time ever, the fertilized egg is isolated, not only physically, but in our minds also existentially, cognitively, and socially. Our ethical norms are fundamental perception of the dignity of human life are beginning to skid, or rather, they are skidding already. This is, of course, a variation of the slippery slope argument. But here, what is slippery sloping is conceptions. It is not that we do harm to any persons or any single individuals. It is the conception of dignity that is skidding. So we are the ethical evaluation goes through conceptions, not through acts against individual persons. So the ethical orientation is based on conceptions of values. And I think we wouldn't discuss things not to such a degree at least, in that way, based on conceptions nowadays either. So I think this is a strange way of discussing too. Now I think time runs much faster than I thought. So I'll skip some of this and go to 2001, where we had a very interesting discussion in Denmark. And I think what came up was that this figure, where you base your ethical argumentations on ideals and you want to support specific life forms, that was just, that disappeared. And I think it disappeared, as a matter of fact, in the discussion, at least to some degree, in the discussions in the Danish Council of Ethics in the period from 2000 to 2010. And I'll give you an example of the new way of thinking that came around in the middle of 2005, in the beginning and in the beginning of 2000. And here you have first the ideal-based conception of a discussion we had concerning whether you should be in a marriage to have IVF. And this is the argument that we should keep on having IVF fertilization or artificial insemination of couples only. The argument goes like this. An assessment cannot solely be justified referring to conflicting surveys on the welfare of the child that may be difficult to weigh against each other. However, these members share the basic view that growing up with the father and mother in relation to whom the child forms his or her personality is a fundamental condition in human life. It is important to give children the opportunity to be introduced to an identity with different roles and role models, since a family, as mentioned, includes two adults of either gender. It gives the family special dynamics that may be difficult to achieve through other couple formation. Finally, the nuclear family is a tried and tested and well-established family form which from the outset is linked to certain and largely accepted ideals of a healthy functioning family. Here you can see it again, an ideal that forms the attitude that we shouldn't inseminate women outside a couple. But then a new way of thinking emerged, I think, and I will present that way of thinking for you here by with the help of another quotation. Some of the council members do not find that it should be possible through legislation to exclude certain groups, single mothers or lesbian couples, from using artificial insemination as it is practiced today, based on Section 3 on the Danish Act on Artificial Insemination. This opinion is, among other things, based on several psychological surveys which suggest that it is difficult to conclude anything about the well-being of a child from knowledge about the family structure. That is, if the family consists of single parents or homosexual couples, etc. For example, it was concluded in a survey from 1998 of 80 families with children conceived by donor insemination and varying family structures that there were no difference between the family structures. So this is another way of discussion where you skip the ideals and go directly to another question. Are anyone harmed by the technology? Does it hurt or harm anyone? So away with ideals and yes to questions that are, at least to some degree, empirical questions. How does a family structure influence the welfare of a child? And I think that structure of argumentation is able to find in most of the writings of the Danish Council of Ethics after 2005. In that way of discussing things, well, you ask the question, does a given practice violate the right of any of the persons involved? And you ask the question, does a given practice cause harm to anyone? So you have, so to speak, skipped the ideals and you have gone to much more concrete questions. So you ask about, for example, equality and justice and so on, and look after if anyone is hurt or has lost hers or his rights. Let me just give one example of this. Finally, if we go to this in 2014, when we discussed parentship in relation to persons who had had a legal sex change. Now, at that time, a large majority finds it obvious that persons who have changed their legal gender identity should have access to assisted reproduction according to the same rules as any other citizen. Any other outcome would it be discriminatory in the opinion of the members. So now here we have a justice structure and a rights discussion instead of an ideals discussion with ideals of family and so on. I have to say that this is, of course, just a very short version of the history of the Danish Council of Ethics. And in some areas, of course, we have had ideal-based discussions too. Now my time has gone, I guess, but I think I should say just a little bit about how I think the Danish Council of Ethics is going to discuss things in the future. I think that we will see a revival of virtue ethics. We have just published a report on data in the healthcare sector. And in that report, we discussed, for example, trust. We have to trust the government. We have to trust the physicians. If we don't do that, it will not be possible to get all these transformations of data. It will not be possible because without trust, it can't be handled. And I think we will see the same in other areas, that we will return to trying to form the virtues that, so to speak, creates coherence in society and makes society function. This was a little fast. I apologize. Thanks.
Thank you, Henrik. I wonder if our other two speakers could come and join us for the panel discussion. Okay, so I'd like to invite questions from the audience. It's a very interesting session with a lot of very varied topics. So I see our first question here.
Well, one reflection. I was one of the two. I'm Barbara Westerholm and Kerstin Hagenfeldt. Could you stand up there? Oh. We are classmates also, medical studies. We were at that meeting in 1984. And before that, I was head of the National Board of Health and Welfare, and a number of ethical questions came up in the early 80s. So I wrote to all our scientific medical advisors to ask them what's around the corner which needs ethical consideration. The two answers I got, I have none. Obviously, they were blind to this. And I think the councils like this has a very important role to play to always remind the clinical scientific profession about the ethical considerations which have to be made. And sadly enough, we have one very recent case in Sweden. 3 patients have got implantation of artificial trachea with a very bad outcome. And obviously, no ethical consideration was made before this started. And it underlines that we have to watch for those early signals in science, in research, on diagnostic and treatment methods, so that we can have a proper evaluation and not expose patients to dangerous treatments. This is just a comment.
Thank you. Actually, can I ask Lotta about that? I mean, you made the point that actually perhaps we like things that we know. And so we tend to discuss subjects we know, and it speaks to exactly this point, that is it the role of ethics councils to actually be coming very early in the process, to actually be flagging those kind of ethical considerations. But the difficulty with that is engaging politicians at that stage can be difficult because, of course, they have very real issues facing them in that moment. So how do you manage the timing issue? And I'd like to ask that of our other panelists also.
That's a tricky question. That's why we choose to at least add that in the presentation. Because we talk, or in the council, the members talk a lot about we have to make the right priorities, we have to be in time. And then now we have this structured process that have improved the prioritizing process within the council. And then the council members send in their proposals, and we do the prioritization, and we end up with a few topics, and then you start to think, okay, well, is this the most pressing ones?
Difficult.
So, yeah, difficult.
Jean-Claude?
Yes, I think we try when we are working on one question, not only to work on this question, but to see what sometimes more important question might be raised that are not seen because everybody is looking at what is happening. And I really think that the earliest the reflection and the public debate can happen, and the more it's possible to orient things in a way that will be the most respectful. Once something is already there, it's often a reflection of enthusiasm or panic. We should not use it, or we should use it. And you don't have the time to reflect because you are confronted to the reality. So sometimes you have to reflect on something which is urgent, but each time it can be done without the pressure of an application. I think the debate can be more profound. One of the problems is that sometimes politicians, institutionals say, but it's too early. It's not an emergency. So I think what we try, I mean, giving the idea that ethic reflection should be in between and not in the emergency is something that that I think is important in the public debate. The opinions are less crystallized. There is less violence in the debate when things are not already there.
Henrik?
We choose the subjects we are going to work on each year, and the members send in subjects, and then we have a meeting, and then they have to convince the other members that what they have brought in is the most interesting and exciting thing. And as a matter of fact, we have a list of relevant criteria that goes into this discussion. I can't remember all of them, but for example, if there are any new questions, or if they have been discussed in the council before, that's one of them. Are they relevant in relation to legislation, for example, and so on? So we have a checklist to be sure that things are relevant. And then, of course, we have some free space if something comes up. And something always comes up.
Yeah.
Just I don't know if it's we have an obligation in some way, institutional, to respond when questions are asked by the government, by the president, or by some institution. So then the question is, how do we ask the question? But in fact, we should do it. And all the reflection is, how do we treat it? But we have also the questions that we choose to treat. And then there is a process that you were alluding to. And so it's always an equilibrium between what we have to do because society is asking us, and what we think would be useful to do.
Christian.
Thank you. What I wonder is, did you ever discuss the name of national ethics councils in your councils? Because as far as I can say for myself, as the chair of the German Ethics Council at the moment, is that I really don't like the name National Ethics Council. Because what we are doing is far more than ethics. And there are a lot of misunderstandings in the public and politics here in this room as well. Some of you asked already, what is an ethicist? For me, it's perfectly clear. It's an expert in ethics, like a biologist is an expert in biology. But of course, an expert in ethics is not an expert in morals, necessarily. It's not the best man in the world or the best woman in the world. But so what's about just calling them Council of Ethical, Legal and Social Aspects in Life Sciences? Or Council of Ethical, Legal and Social Aspects in Economics? And what you, Jean-Claude, proposed or asked is perfectly right. I think in economics, there should also be some kind of council and some implementation, not to go beyond expertise, because there are several kinds of expertise, but to introduce other kinds of expertise in the debate, and not doing or acting like that some people who are in charge of doing something are the experts and can decide everything in economics. Economics has at least as wide-reaching implications in society like life sciences. And when someone learns about the German Ethics Council, I'm often asked, do you care for the economic ethics? And I say, of course not, we're just in charge of life sciences, but that would be wonderful if there would be a broader perspective on economics as well, I suppose.
Maybe just we consider, but it's cultural. We consider in the French committee that there is no ethicist. Each one is contributing to something which is an ethical reflection, but nobody is a specialist. When I'm speaking about going beyond expertise, it's, for example, bringing laypersons. It's beyond expertise. Everybody is, a patient is an expert, but it's just what we mean by expertise in the field. And you're right, everybody can be an expert, but it's going beyond the expertise. I like the fact that it's called ethics committee. In France, it's consultative ethics committee. So it's not taking decisions, because it's ambiguous and it allows to ask the question, what is ethical reflection about? Bioethics, I think, is trapping the subject. I don't know what it means, because it's ethics of life, and I think we are reflecting about ethics of human respect, not of life in itself. Biomedical ethics is also restrictive, so I think it's nice maybe to have a term which is sufficiently open for us to try to question it and to define and to find our field. In France, it's, as I said, a Consultative National Ethics Committee on Life Science and Health. And because health, the WHO report about the social determinants and economic determinants of health, the work of Michael Marmot, there is a huge part of economy which is relevant to health. The only thing is, I don't think an ethical committee can take it in its broadness, and it should also be, economists should also ask themselves with other the question, and not only our kind of ethical committees.
Come up with a comment on that? Well, I wanted to, before I wanted to ask John Harris, what is an informed debate in relation to ethical questions and in relation to ethical matters? Because you ask for an informed debate, and well, I'm a philosopher too, so I know that the last 2,000 years philosophers has discussed what is ethics, has ethical statements, truth value. What is it? Is it just feelings, or is it cognition, as you mentioned? And that goes in the direction of what you're saying. What is ethical expertise? And I think that's an extremely interesting and relevant debate in relation to the councils in Europe and other places. How do we form a well-informed ethical debate without knowing what ethics is?
I think that's a very timely question, because John is next on my list, actually. So, John, if you want to make a quick response and then ask your question.
My response to that is actually the point I wish to make. The chairman of the German committee just said ethical committees deal with things that are far more than ethics. My question is, how do you know when you're even dealing with ethics? Even dealing with ethics. And that should be your question. I was struck actually by your experience of the change in fashion, which is, I can only call it fashion, in decisions of the Danish committee over the years. If an ethical opinion or an ethical judgment is not just an opinion or judgment about something acknowledged to be an ethical issue. So not all opinions about the ethics of abortion are ethical opinions. Ethical opinions have to meet minimum standards of evidence and argument. They must not be prejudiced. They must not be simply repeating common or garden accepted views. They must be willing to support them by evidence, relevant evidence and argument where necessary. They mustn't simply just be parroting the views of others. Now, the example that struck me in the ethics Danish thing when looking at assisted reproduction was this employment of the notion of a healthy, functioning family, with obviously absolutely no analysis of what healthy meant in that context, of what functioning meant in that context, and no apparent awareness of all the sorts of family models that have been operating in human societies over centuries and centuries. What was shocking to me about that was that that was just accepted as a reasonable basis for a conclusion which denied people a valuable therapy, which isolated them and their lifestyles and a whole range of other things. Now, lots of philosophers were not making those mistakes in 1980, whatever it was, but ethics committees were and continue to do so. And I believe one of the reasons they continue to do so is they do not have an operating conception of what turns an opinion into an ethical opinion. And I've given you some of the constraints that have to operate on that.
Henrik, would you like to comment? Other than us populating all our national committees with philosophers, then other than that, is there another way of doing it? And if you could be brief, because I see a number of people indicating.
Well, I would say the way we do it, or try to do it, is that we try to put persons with very different perspectives on ethics together. And then we hope then that discussions will transform their perspectives in a qualified way. And I think that's sometimes what happens. But still, I think this is a very difficult thing to discuss if we don't really know what an ethical evaluation or an ethical statement is. You come up with some criteria concerning what ethics is, but maybe some theories and some arguments are just illusions at a higher level, so to speak.
Even if you ignored my question about what ethics is, you should be able to look at an alleged justification for an opinion like, is this consistent with something being a healthy, functioning family? And be able to analyze those terms and actually have an answer to the question, are these just words? A healthy, functioning family is motherhood and apple pie.
Yes, yes.
But the question is, in what sense might the families that don't conform to this model be unhealthy? In what sense would they be dysfunctional? And unless you've got an analysis of that, I don't think you could not conceivably, in my view, be entitled to use a phrase like that in justification of denying people opportunities for care and for health care and opportunities, in this case, to have a family.
Just a small comment.
A very, very tiny comment, because there are other people.
Well, if you have to justify ethical values, then I think about what Wittgenstein says, explanations come to an end sometime. And when does it come to an end? That's the open question, but it does come to an end. So we have to live with claims that we can't justify.
And this exchange is now going to have to come to an end, because I have a question up at the back. Thank you.
My name is Jochen Taubitz from the German Ethics Council. I have first a question to Henrik Jørgensen. You talked about the different focuses of your council on ideals, on harm or violations, and then on rights. But is there really a development in this sense? Because I think if it's an interdisciplinary body, the Ethics Council, then the different disciplines must have their words, must have their wordings, must have their different focuses on the topics. And in our German Ethics Council, we mix the different arguments. They are not only ethical arguments, but also, of course, legal arguments we have in our publications and so on. So is that really a development? And a second question to Lotta Eriksson. You told us that in your council you have also politicians, active politicians from the different political parties. Do they bring the political discussions, the political disputes into the council? In our German Ethics Council we don't have active politicians or active members of ministries. There are old politicians that are not yet more members of the parliament and so on. And we have never had a situation where political arguments or political positions have been a point in our discussions.
Thank you. Lotte?
I'll answer short on that. It depends.
Very diplomatic. You don't want to expand? Yeah. Christoph, I saw there was another question here. Yeah.
So hello, Christian Munter from Göteborg. This thing about a council or a body, like I think these bodies are different in important ways. So one way was just pointed out. So I was on the council for 2 periods, 6 years. And for me, it was a very enlightening experience. I'm a philosopher. I'm that type of ethicist, right? So for me, it was a very enlightening and learning experience to work with the politicians in the room. Because that meant developing good argument is just part of the story. So this happened several times to me, that you developed a good argument, you found the consensus in the room. Then the politician says, well, now you have to find a way of describing this so I can take it to my parliamentary group and get the consensus there so we can have the vote in the parliament and actually pass the bill at the end of the day. So that was a very interesting thing. So I think that level, if you're supposed to sort of work into decision-making on regulations and law or not having regulations and laws, that has to be part of it. Then you have this thing with oversight and foresight that was brought up. And I think one thing that happened several times when I was on the council, this was before this more strict priority setting rules that Lotta described. What often happens that someone opened a question and we said, well, okay, we don't know where that is going, but let's invite some of the people that are supposed to know something about it, and they could give a brief, and we listen to it, and sometimes we concluded, well, we'll continue to look into it, or no, okay, we'll let it rest for now. But then at least, when it becomes more urgent, you're a bit prepared. And if you're going to be cancelled when it's urgent, you better be prepared. That was my idea about these things.
Any other questions? Patrick.
It is just a comment, and to go back on what something Jean-Claude said about the French Council, who has decided more or less not to prescribe, not to give recommendations, but to really furbish the reflection, the common reflection. It comes to my mind when I was a young member a long time ago. I heard the former chair of our committee, Didier Sicard, who was saying, I was very surprised, he said, we're not here to answer questions we are being asked. I was really surprised. I thought we were there for that purpose. And he said, no, we are more here to probably unravel the inherent complexity which underlies apparently simple questions. And he added something which was very important. And most of all, we are here for those questions to be asked and not be hidden in the society. And I think it's really something which should feed our reflection about our committees. Are we here to prescribe, or are we here to really give things for people to think about?
Yes, if I can add something. For me, it's but maybe because my formation, it's the difference between knowledge and research. Research is asking new questions, and when you have no question to ask, it doesn't further. So I think the ethics is asking new question regarding human dignity, human respect, human rights, even question, and most often questions that nobody, I mean, where everybody thinks there are only answers, right? And as long as we think there are only answers, we won't change. But as you know, Patrick, it's often a very big temptation to recommend. And so the decision not to recommend, but to help others to reflect, asks for a kind of humility, because there is often a temptation to say what should be done, even if it's only consultative. So I think it's really a kind of discipline to learn to help others. But I think in the medical world it has been the same. For a long time, a doctor was telling what should be done. Today, a doctor should at least, not only always does it, help somebody to choose what the person thinks is the best.
Yes, Ariane.
My name is Ariane Willemsen. I'm from one of the Swiss ethics committees. We have two of them. And I find it is important to know that ethics committees are some kind of a hybrid. Like in our committee, we have more than half of the members that are ethics experts. And it is important from my point of view that if an ethics committee is scrutinizing questions, it has to look into the ethical theories that are lying behind the questions and the answers that are coming up from these different theories. And it is important to spread out all this analysis. And then in the end, what opinions the members have is just a little part of the whole analysis. And that shows that it is a hybrid. On the one hand, it should be an ethical analysis based on the ethical theories and the different answers that these theories give. And on the other hand, it is a summary of the moral convictions that these members have in the end, based on the ethical analysis that they have done before.
In Denmark, we have had that discussion, at least to some degree, whether the members should have an agreement, should have an opinion, and should state that opinion in the papers and so on. And I think that they do, and I think there's a reason for that, because in most ethical questions, in relation to most ethical questions, what the council do is to describe what is at stake, describe the dilemma, describe which kinds of values are involved and which kinds of theories are involved. But when you then have to come up with a recommendation or a statement about what should happen, I think what is happening very often is that you have to weigh some ways of thinking against other ways of thinking. So there's almost always an element of weighing up values against each other. And I think that's, as a matter of fact, a very important part of an ethical decision these days, because we agree. I mean, there's a big agreement about, I think, which values are involved. So a lot of the discussion is about how to weigh those values up against each other. And that's why we might need statements from each and every single member about what they mean, what they think, what they recommend.
I see it more as an emerging process. I'll go back to research. The most fecund research are pluridisciplinary research. It's difficult because usually a biologist wants a physicist to help him and doesn't want to work together. But when you work together, something new emerges, something that none of the participants alone could see. So I think the problem when it works is not what each member thinks, it's what has emerged that nobody was seeing before the process begins. And I think it's just one model of how rich can be the fact that different people begin to think together. And it's one of the reasons that your country was a pioneer in this setting. I was very surprised when we made when we organized a citizen conference to see that people which didn't know each other and that could inform themselves and discuss with a lot of people that they choose were making emerge something. And the interesting question was, what is the added value of a committee as ourselves compared to a committee made just by different people? If you take similar people, you just have declination of what the people thought before. So how, and I think it's the essence of democracy, it's not choosing as often in our country between opposing or different views, listening and choosing. It's trying together to allow the emergence of a view that's a solution, a way of seeing that nobody had before. And for me, the more we are more an example of how society should deal, that a centerpiece. And I think what I believe is if we can allow and show that when different people think together, they contribute to the society, it can be declined in many forms, and we are just an incitation and not the institution where all should happen.
Okay, with that, I'd like to draw this session to a conclusion because I want to let us all avail of the fantastic Swedish tradition of fika. But I think it's been really interesting, this session, the idea that after 30 years in existence, we're still having discussions about what the scope of what national ethics committees should be discussing. Are we properly constituted? How we engage in ethical reflection, if that's what it is. And I think that's really actually speaks to the fact that we are in fact reflective as a bunch of people. And I think that's a good thing. So thank you all very much. And thank you to our wonderful speakers.
I must thank Smer for inviting me here. It's an honor to chair one of the sessions in this kind of very well planned and well organized meeting. It looks like the nature is even on your side, because when I was here last time at the end of April, in one meeting, the sun was shining. We have had pretty rainy, windy, and cloudy summer and cold, both in Sweden and in Finland. And now the sun is shining again. And I hope that this meeting will be like as much sunshine as the program looks. I'm Ritva Halila. I'm the General Secretary of National Advisory Board on Healthcare, Social Affairs and Healthcare Ethics in Finland. So I feel like a little sister, and I have always looked at you as not as a big brother. Maybe you have the same program in television, but big sister or big brother, whatever, something that has been there already when we started in 1999. So we are growing up, but I remember when I was chosen to be a General Secretary, the first thing that was suggested to me was to go and visit the colleagues in Sweden and Denmark. And here we are in the same meeting. But back to business. Now our perspective will widen a little bit to international affairs. And so we have an honor to have here guests from the Council of Europe and also WHO. And then the last speaker is from Nuffield Council on Bioethics. First, Laurence Wolff from the Council of Europe will present her presentation. You're welcome.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Ritva. I feel that I have to call everybody by his first name here, so because I mean, from one way or another, a lot of people here have been involved in the work of the Council of Europe and are still involved in the work of the Council of Europe. So, I just wish, when starting this, to thank the SMER, but also I would like to stress one thing to start these discussions. You said, Ritva, that we are starting the sessions to talk about international level. Well, Council of Europe is regional compared to WHO. But the first sessions was, the last session was on National Ethics Committee, but one point was raised by Lotte about the importance of international cooperation and international involvement of National Ethics Committee on issues that are actually shared or discussed by different National Ethics Committee. And I would like to remind you about the first meeting of COMETH. So the network, the European Network of National Ethics Committee, which was set up by the Council of Europe, which is not really, can I say, what did you say, John? Almost death, or what did you say? Death enough? Well, was not really so active, but I think the idea of a need for international exchange was behind this launching of this network for the Council of Europe, and I want to stress the motivation and the active move of the National Ethics Committee of Sweden in starting this, because the first meeting of COMETH was actually organized in Stockholm, hosted by this SMER. So now the subject of my presentation will focus on work which is not a National Ethics Committee, neither an International Ethics Committee, but intergovernmental committee. And when talking about bioethics, I was trying to avoid a discussion with John Harris. I will talk about human rights, but I don't think it will actually save me from the discussions, but that we'll see later on. Because actually, this is exactly what the Council of Europe has been doing. And to start with, I'm not going to go back to the 40 years of the Council of Europe work in this field, but I think when talking about relevance and challenges, it is interesting to look at what was the starting point for this work, what has changed, and why it remains relevant in the motivation for this work at the Council of Europe. So it started in the 70s, and the initial motivation of the Council of Europe was the rapidly evolving field of biomedicine, with increasing possibility to intervene, control human life, and the concerns about misuses and abuses. I think this was true in the 70s, but I think it could be argued that it remained very true. Rapidly evolving, I think what has changed is the speed by which it's evolving. And possibility to intervene, it's the scale of this possibility that has changed as well. So I would say what was the motivation to start this work remained extremely relevant. This work was started in the framework of the mission of the Council of Europe, which is the protection of human rights. And there was, I would argue, two objectives that are working in synergy: protecting human rights in the biomedical field and promoting development in the biomedical field for the benefit of the human beings, in particular human health. This human rights approach has been constantly underlined and continued to be valid, has been even reinforced, I would say, by the reorganization of committees in the Council of Europe, which create closer link between the Committee on Bioethics, which is the intergovernmental committee responsible for the activity in this field, and the Steering Committee on Human Rights. And I cannot but highlight the importance of the work done by National Ethics Committee throughout these years as contributing to the discussions at European level, and I would say even international level. And I think it's important to quote the person who was at that time president of the European Court of Human Rights when we celebrated the 10th anniversary of the entry into force of the Oviedo Convention, who actually paid tribute to the consultative committees in the field of ethics at national as well as European and international level, composed of qualified personality engaged in discussion on ethical issue, which may suggest modification of text in force or adoption of ad hoc instrument. And that was Jean-Paul Costa, who was at that time the president of the Court of Human Rights. So I think this is something extremely important and quite timely to remember and highlight. I mentioned the Oviedo Convention because I think it's important, again, to understand what was the starting point, to go from what was a soft law type of activity to legally binding instrument, because I think it remains quite relevant. Interesting to note that it was an initiative of the Justice Ministry at that time, and there was a recognition of a need to integrate into national legislation principle accepted by all member states, based on European value, that is to say, human rights value for the Council of Europe. So All the work of the Council of Europe does not aim at standard setting. I think this is important to keep in mind, but this is certainly, the Oviedo Convention was certainly an important step, both an achievement and a starting point, I would argue. And it became a reference at national, European, as well as global level. National level, I go quickly. I think it's always difficult to judge whether something has direct influence on practices and legislation, but in that particular case, I think we could say this because it's based on the feedback from the member states themselves. When we celebrated the anniversary of the entry into force of the convention, there was a questionnaire sent to all competent authority of the member states, which came back with clearly acknowledgement of the influence the convention had and the work of the Council of Europe had on legislation and practices, even from countries that are not even signatory to the convention. European level, well, the influence is well known, I guess, at EU level with reference in directive. The Charter of Fundamental Rights is actually borrowing principle laid down initially in the Oviedo Convention, Article 3 in particular, and other articles as well. But I think what is interesting is to see the evolution of the case law of the European Court of Human Rights that's been building up over the last 15 years, I would say, with more and more issues that could be considered as relevant to the biomedical field. The court using not only the Oviedo Convention, actually, but also the work done at intergovernmental level as a reference in their analysis of the case and in their decision. I just mentioned, for example, I think Mr. Taupis is here, the report on the protection of the embryo in vitro, which was not even a legal instrument, was actually referred to by the court. The guide on end-of-life decision-making process regarding medical treatment in end-of-life situation was actually largely quoted by the court in a very recent case, Lambert against France. And the Oviedo Convention is regularly mentioned as a sort of an instrument of reference for the interpretation of the European Convention on Human Rights. Global level, well, the UNESCO Declaration on Human Rights and Bioethics referred to the Oviedo Convention. It's probably one of the rare cases where at global level a regional instrument is referred to. But also interestingly, we see the Inter-American Court of Human Rights referring to the Oviedo Convention in its decisions. The case law of this court is not very developed on issue related to the biomedical field, but you have an example here which is quite recent of a case concerning access to IVF, where the court is actually referring to the Oviedo Convention. And while being a regional instrument, we see more and more interest outside Europe for the work done at the Council of Europe. And an example to illustrate that is Mexico's interest and formal request to accede to the Oviedo Convention. And there are currently active moves at governmental levels toward the accession to the conventions, which would make Mexico the first non-European country to ratify this convention. So altogether, I think this reference work shows also the relevance of that work, of the legal instrument that is the convention, but also of the work in general done at intergovernmental level at the Council of Europe. Oops, it's not quite finished yet. So what are we doing now, and what are the possible challenges? Well, I think the objective, the double objective mentioned at the beginning, which is protecting human rights, promoting development for the benefit of human beings in the biomedical field, remains really valid. I would say the changes is that more than going into developing a lot of standard setting, a lot of legally binding instruments, the focus is more into the implementation of the adopted instruments, but not entirely. There are still the need to reinforce the legal corpus, and we see that also based on the jurisprudence of the court and the relevance of this principle and the needs to set standards to ensure that the principles are respected. And this is the case with this new additional protocol that is currently made public as a working document for consultation, then you could see on our website, on the protection of persons with mental disorder with regard to involuntary treatment and placement. It's also important to reinforce this legal corpus by re-examining regularly instruments in the light of development. But one element which is also important to highlight in this context about in relation to the relevance of this work and the principles adopted is the interest of those principles in other fields than the biomedical field. And that leads to more cooperation with data protection field, with criminal law field. The recent convention against trafficking in organs, which is a criminal law piece of instrument, two principles laid down in the Oviedo Convention, informed consent and prohibition of financial gain, are really pillar for the definition of criminal actions in this convention. More emphasis on implementation and adopted principle. I think this is more and more the focus of the work. It's not without challenges. It's probably more challenging than, to a certain point, standard setting activity, at least at one point. But it's still possible to achieve results even on very sensitive areas such as end of life. And I think the guide that was published last year, which is already available in a lot of non-European, non-official languages, European but non-official languages, on our website, show this success. It's not a legal instrument, but it was a wish to try to facilitate the implementation of principles laid down in legally binding instrument. A new issue that is currently being tackled is prohibition of financial gain. I don't need to explain the challenges that are raised by this issue. I think that this is an issue which is probably relevant at global level as well, and WHO would also be closely associated to this initiative. So you see the challenges are still there. What is to be noticed also, and again, it goes into the, as an argument for the relevance of this work, is the increasing interest of legal professionals for, let's say, bioethical principle and legal instrument developed in that field. I think this was confirmed at the last conference of the HELP project. HELP is a project of the Council of Europe for human rights education of legal professionals, where there was a very strong support for the development of a course on core principle and bioethics for legal professional and non-legal professional, and we are actually developing that project currently. Just incidentally, we are also developing a course on the Charter of Fundamental Rights at the request of the European Commission within the framework of the same HELP program. Now, there are also challenges. I mentioned relevance. There are also challenges. There are the long-lasting challenges, I would say, the ones that were already there when the convention was elaborated, cultural differences, globalization. It may be argued that this has actually increased globalization, but I would also argue that it's both a challenge and supportive of work at international level as well. I would add to this short list tension between economy and bioethical principles, tension between individual rights and collective benefits. The list can be long. They are not necessarily new, but they are coming on the forefront and the tensions are really there. But I would say that there are new challenges which are linked to the evolution of the field, which was the focus of the work so far. And this came up really clearly at the last conference that the Committee on Bioethics has organized in May this year on emerging technology and their convergence. I would summarize it, but it's not exhaustive, by the expression the blurring of lines or the breaching of usual boundaries. The fact that the focus has been on fields that have really clear boundaries before, with specific legal instrument, specific governance in place very often, and suddenly those clear boundaries are blurred. The boundary between what is the biomedical field and what is not the biomedical field. An example, you have those device based on electrostimulation of the brain, external stimulation of the brain, which are, I would say, biomedical technology, but you can have access on internet to one of those headsets that are sold to improve your performance as a gamer. So we see more and more with this technology the possibility to apply it outside the medical field or outside the, would say, the field where health professionals are actually the main actors of biomedical technology, if we could just summarize it. Or the blurring of line within the biomedical field between clinics and research. And here I would say the value, increasing value of health-related data, of biological samples, are blurring the line between what was really clinical and what was really research before with specific governance and legislations. And the patients becoming indirectly or smoothly going into the research path as a research participant through the data being used and the sample being used is certainly also an example of the blurring of line. I'm just trying to illustrate what I mean by this. And again, this massive productions of data, including by actors that have nothing to do with the biomedical field, including by ourselves individually with the connected object, are also contributing to blurring the line between what is private and what is the public field. So this is an open discussion. This was only things raised during this conference, but clearly it raised questions about the scope of the activities, and I would not necessarily talk only about international level. I think this is possibly true also at national level. The legal gaps, the applicability of principle defined in the biomedical field, outside this field, the governance, all these calling certainly for the promotion of a public debate. And I think these are real challenges, certainly for the Council of Europe work, but I think also at national level. So in conclusions, human rights protection in the biomedical field, I think it remains of long-lasting relevance. I think human rights protection remains of long-lasting relevance, even outside the biomedical field. There are certain lines of actions that continue to be there, where necessary reinforcing legal corpus, but working on implementation of adopted principle, that is not deprived of challenges, as I mentioned, and raising awareness, training, and educations of legal and non-legal professionals. And I will quote again the current president of the Court of Human Rights in May, who insists on the importance for legal professionals to be trained also on the Oviedo Convention and not only on the Convention on Human Rights. But there are also, as I said, long-lasting challenges and new challenges. And we cannot afford but going into this debate and analysis and discussion linked to those new challenges. And I would like to end by quoting two people in Sweden that have a key role in ethics, national level, but also European level, and I'm pleased to see that one of them is in the room. So, Daniel Tarschys, former Secretary of the Council of Europe, who made that, who pronounced in its discourse when we, the opening for signature of the first protocol to the conventions regarding cloning, who underlined the privileged forum that the Council of Europe would constitute for debate on science and technology. And Göran Hermeren, who is not with us today, I understand he was impeached, but who also been really active. He was actually among those who drafting the Oviedo Convention. I think his role also at European level is quite well known, who referred to those tensions I was referring to and the challenges, but talked about the Oviedo Convention as playing an important role for policymakers and serve as a useful guide. I have to be honest, this was said with regard to the EU, but I think it could be extended to the whole Europe more widely. And I just want to add by saying that this public debate that has been really discussed before, and which actually is one of the principles of the Oviedo Convention, Article 28 is actually asking for the promotion of public debate, but also stress the importance of National Ethics Committee in promoting this public debate at national level, obviously, but possibly also at international level. Tack så mycket.
We take all the three presentations. So the next speaker is Abba Saxena, who is a coordinator of the ethics unit in World Health Organization. Abba, you have the floor.
Hi, good morning and good afternoon, actually. And thank you for inviting me to this conference. And actually, I have to apologize. I was late because of some problem in my flights. So I did miss the earlier part of this conference. I'm Dr. Abha Saxena. I'm the coordinator for Global Health Ethics Unit at WHO. And just as a brief introduction, my unit is responsible for developing normative guidance in the area of global ethics, more usually related to research ethics and public health ethics. We're also the coordinate or the sort of secretariats for several global bodies, for example, the Global Summit for National Ethics Committees, and also for, we have a network of collaborating centers which we use to increase our work. And we provide technical support to member states in the area of ethics when required and requested to do so. I'm using the lens of epidemics and pandemics through which to consider the ethical issues that arise in relation to new technology in health generally, and the challenges faced by countries that are less developed and caught unawares in an epidemic. I'm using this, the lens of epidemics basically to reflect on what used to happen in epidemics and what currently happens in managing epidemics and the ethical challenges raised by that. The time has come to close the book on infectious diseases. We have basically wiped out infection in the United States. This was a statement attributed famously or infamously, and perhaps incorrectly, to the Surgeon General of the USA way back in 1967. It appears that this is perhaps a medical legend, but it is, oh, sorry, I'm sorry, I didn't, this doesn't work. It appears that this is perhaps a medical legend, but it is correct that in the 60s and the 70s, there was a widespread belief that infectious diseases had been conquered. But that was perhaps before the arrival of AIDS and SARS and hepatitis C and MDR-TB. This graph shows the number of emerging infectious disease events per decade since the 1940s. And you can see there's a rising trend. The opening years of the new millennia saw the emergence of many epidemics, not the least of them being the pandemic influenza of 2009. And of course, there was ethical guidance developed for all the new types of infections that reached epidemic proportions. So it was that in the second decade of the new millennia, it seemed appropriate for WHO to focus attention on issues other than communicable diseases, recognizing that in many countries there has been an epidemiological transition and that the growing burden of non-communicable diseases was affecting both developed and developing countries. Rightly so, WHO's focus was on non-communicable diseases, universal health coverage, increasing access to medicinal products, and so on. And of course, infectious diseases remained on the table, but through the agency of the international health regulations. And this agenda was being driven by technological advances, such as mHealth or mobile health, electronic health, big data, the NBIC convergence, genomics, biobanks, etc. Exciting advances were being made in many of these areas that were providing scientists and public health professionals to reach many more people than was earlier possible, and to have access to more data than they had ever thought was possible. And this was possible to do this from many sources and get a more complete picture, to be able to combine various technologies to come up with biotech solutions and improve lives, and also to enhance lives. However, the scientists were also beginning to grapple with solutions and with ethical challenges that these new technologies were bringing up. What would it mean for humanity in general and for specific communities and individuals specifically? In fact, for the bioethicists and also for the national ethics committees, these were exciting times. These were new technologies that raised many interesting ethical dilemmas and quandaries, many of which they were not and we were not able to fathom. And this resulted in many interesting meetings, publications, books, and we have all been at meetings where these have been discussed at length and been a subject of, been a subject of discussion. And then we had Ebola. And this was at the beginning or the middle of last year, actually, to be correct. And we were back to our usual job of preparedness, response, and recovery. Instituting surveillance measures, doing house-to-house case detections, diagnosing cases, burying and counting the dead. We were doing what we were doing 40 years ago or 50 years ago, waiting for the epidemic to end. Even as the epidemic was running its course, world leaders had started discussing the task of recovery and restoring health systems and some normalcy in the lives of people who had been affected by the crisis. So this was in August 2014. As a result of the epidemic, the World Bank Group estimates that Guinea, Liberia, and Sierra Leone will lose at least $1.6 billion in foregone economic growth in 2015. Apart from this huge economic loss, this Ebola epidemic was very different from earlier epidemics, both of Ebola virus disease and also of other diseases in many ways. 1 year into the outbreak, WHO described the situation as an old disease in a new context, not only because transmission occurred for the first time in urban settings, but also because these countries had very fragile health systems to begin with, because of poverty and the fact that they were just recovering from conflicts and were in the process of rebuilding their health systems. A pre-existing low level of trust in the government and any person representing the health system confounded the problem. All this impacted on data collection, care provision, prevention measures, and in fact, all aspects of epidemic control. And this was compounded by the relative lack of technology in these countries. In most developed countries, and in many developing countries as well, monitoring of health trends and developing prediction models is possible electronically. For example, with the use of electronic health records and with the collection and collation of other electronic data held in various databases, and using other informal sources of information. In the Ebola-affected countries, however, in order to study the pathogenesis and natural progression of the disease, about which very little was known, epidemiologists found they still had to work with paper records, most of which were inaccurate, incomplete, or worse, non-existent. It is said that if one wishes to improve the overall health of a population, one must improve the literacy level of that population. In the same way, one could say that if one wishes to improve the public health response to disease and disease outbreak, one must improve the electronic capabilities of the populations concerned and improve the digitalization index of that country. But there are ethical issues related to going digital, and even as one supports countries to improve their digital presence, one must ensure that the human values are not compromised and safeguards in relation to privacy, confidentiality, transparency, and identity protection are in place. And of course, eventually one must be prepared to contribute to the hope and hype of big data. So what is big data? It's defined currently by its ambiguity and complexity. The global dialogue on the use of data is shaped both by hope and anxiety. This was a quote from the World Economic Forum's white paper on pathways for progress. At its broadest, big data refers to large sets of unstructured data, frequently defined by volume, variety, velocity, and value. That, through machine learning and algorithm categorization, can be applied to epidemic management, amongst other things, in a number of ways. For example, for risk stratification, for simulation and geospatial analysis, for resource management, and other various uses. Currently, big data faces a number of technical challenges to improving efficacy, but it promises to be a very helpful tool in the near future. So any country which is beginning to go digital will eventually have to face the challenge of big data, will be contributing to big data, and will have to have regulations governing the use of big data in that country. Mobile phones are a more traditional approach to using new technology. And of course, the use of mobile phones for tracking disease, assessing interventions, and providing training materials and reference materials to healthcare workers working in remote, hard-to-reach areas has been acknowledged. While inequities in ownership still exist, currently in Africa, most mobile phone owners are the older males. But it's predicted that by 2017, 85% of the world's population will have access to wireless coverage. So that's a very promising thought. In particular, the data generated from call detail records. These are the records that mobile phone operators keep for each call that is put through their offices. The mobile phone, so in particular, the data generated from call detail records and mobile phone apps will be an important asset in our future fight against epidemics by allowing us to track and predict patterns of transmission. While there are many existing examples of successful projects using the mobile technology, and many of them in Africa, it should be remembered that the transition to new technology requires not only the new technology itself, but the training of health workers and patients in how to use it. And this needs to begin not during a crisis, but during times of peace, I would say. The 2014 Ebola crisis may well be a game changer in the emerging use and sharing of call detail records for social good. In other words, it's used to inform humanitarian and development action of metadata that telecom operators record primarily to bill customers based on their cell phone usage. So this has been something that has been used extensively in the 3 West African countries in the current epidemic situation, where there was paucity of data and there was paucity of information coming through these countries in relation to where the disease was originating and who were the contacts and how were the contacts placed within the geographical situation. But at the same time that mobile technology is used more traditionally in many settings in the current epidemic to provide healthcare workers with reference and training materials, it shows that they are very helpful to the healthcare workers because they can help them in understanding how to do the correct and proper use, for example, in the Ebola case, of personal protective equipment, how to give safe injections, how to carry out safe burial practices. So such communication helps to minimize infection among the workers who are putting themselves at increased risk and to whom an obligation of reasonable protection is owed. So there are huge gains to be had by implementing new technologies in these countries. A word about public-private partnerships. While public-private partnerships have been playing a crucial role in healthcare, especially during emergencies, as epidemics and outbreaks become more complex and more challenging, they're increasingly becoming more relevant and offering more services. Current data shows that over 150 companies participated in the Ebola response. This number is likely an underestimate, as it misses smaller companies that the tracking process did not pick up. According to available data, the donations of commercial companies the donations of commercial companies are estimated at around $100 to $200 million. But much more was contributed in kind and provision of services. These capabilities include supply chain and logistics, communication technology, biopharma R&D, data analysis, and financial services. For example, a disease mapping system was launched by a leading technology company in October 2014 in these 3 countries. And collaboration between Sierra Leone's largest mobile provider and a tech giant allowed local people to send free text messages about Ebola to the government. And that was, again, hugely helpful in the management of the epidemic as time was moving forward. But the challenge of public-private partnerships is that companies that can provide expert capabilities, they need to establish mechanisms and regulatory processes in advance to minimize transaction costs and achieve quicker and higher returns during an outbreak. The regulatory environment that they're working in, actually that regulatory environment doesn't exist, or at best it is very weak. And therefore, the challenge for these public-private partnerships is not so much as in being able to offer services, but in being able to have the right environment in which they can offer those services. And that needs to be developed, and perhaps not during a crisis, but before a crisis occurs. The third topic I want to talk about as part of the issues during the management of epidemics was conduct of research in the context of an epidemic. This was one of the success stories in this epidemic, because it was found possible to conduct not only basic but also more sophisticated clinical trials in order to find quick answers to the more pressing issues. The field actually was led by bioethicists who guided the development of research projects and conduct of research through developing literally guidance on the go. While new rules were being written, it was also demonstrated that it was feasible to do high-quality, valid research, even in the midst of epidemics in very challenging circumstances. Both the process and the outcome of this activity will hopefully become some sort of a benchmark for future epidemics as well. And of course, where we failed in one particular area, we failed in being able to harness the information that we could have from data and samples, biosamples, because of lack of capacities. And we failed as in currently we don't have good solutions, but we hope that we will have good solutions in the end. The lack of capacities, the need for monetary assistance, absence of regulations left the clinical and research field open to misuse. Data has not been shared, samples are being stored at individual lab level, or at worst being destroyed for lack of availability of storage. And rules for cooperation and collaboration in data and sample sharing are yet to be written. The ideal scenario is that a global data bank exists that allows meaningful research to be done, and the products of that research are made available in the public space. So, what is the cumulative effect of all these sort of things that are happening, sort of not necessarily connected to each other, but still being connected to each other? While each technology and intervention discussed here individually and cumulatively changes the paradigm of healthcare and medicine, each presents its own unique set of challenges and opportunities. It is important to take time to consider cumulative effects. The goals of employing new technology in pursuit of preventing epidemics may blind us to the incremental but potentially irreversible sacrifices that are made when we siphon control from human hands into technological ones. An attempt to use technology to move away from human fallibility and limitation will mean moving towards something else, and that it is not always clear what this might be. While parts of the world may be comfortable enough with technology to barely notice this change, partly also because the technology has been around for a long, long time in these areas, using technology in places where it has not become so embedded in everyday life could raise the same issues as in Ebola, when white suits and the lack of sensitivity to burial practices hindered the response effort. So where is this technological trajectory taking us? Inasmuch as there exists an ethical imperative to prepare for epidemics, with a view to preventing and at least mitigating the resultant harms, there also exists an ethical imperative to prepare for the ethical issues raised by the various possible methods of prevention or crisis management. Given the need for quick decisions by policymakers, international organizations, and healthcare workers alike, often there's not enough time to reflect or to deliberate on the ethical issues, many of which are complex due to the uncertainty that surrounds an epidemic. And actually, in the earlier part of this meeting, we heard about the issues raised by the lack of time in discussing and deliberating on some issues. With the new technologies coming into the equation about which there may be insufficient understanding, the task becomes even harder. The burden of making, 2 minutes. The burden of making the wrong decision is very great, yet it must be made with limited and perhaps conflicting and complex information, often by those from whom such complex judgment calls are not usually required, such as local healthcare workers. Ethical questions that are difficult to answer in an individual case must now be answered on the behalf of many individuals at once. It is these challenges to effective practical and ethical deliberations posed during an epidemic that create an imperativeness for preparedness. Such deliberation should be begun in preparation for an epidemic. For an epidemic is bound to affect us sometime, so that ultimately a comprehensive ethical framework is in place when required. Such an approach respects and benefits both decision makers and those about whom the decisions are being made. So where does that bring us? We were talking about Ebola or an epidemic in 2020. So when the next Ebola epidemic occurs in 2020, there is an expectation that the country in question will have a stable health system that is well prepared to use modern digital tools, has a well-regulated health and digital system, has a well-established data governance system, has rules and governance mechanisms for public-private partnerships, and is able to contribute effectively to both health provision and health research in the face of an epidemic. The country in question will have deliberated on the ethical issues well in advance of the epidemic and will be prepared to mount a response which is deliberative and well-informed, and has involved the public and the healthcare system well in advance. In fact, if such a scenario exists in 2020, then perhaps there will be no Ebola epidemic in 2020, because the disease would have been controlled even before it reached the outbreak or epidemic proportion. So thank you.
Thank you. Then the last speaker of this session, Hugh Whitall from NAFEL Council of Bioethics from United Kingdom. You have the floor.
Okay. Thank you. I need to want to be able to see the screen. Thank you very much indeed for the opportunity to come and speak to you today and to join you in the celebration of 30 years. Congratulations. It's nice to be back here. I'm familiar with this room. I was here, I think, a little over 2 years ago when we talked about mitochondrial replacement therapy. So I feel as though I'm at home amongst friends. So thank you. Of course, you talked about being the younger sister. Maybe we're not quite so young, but maybe a younger brother. We were only established in 1991, so almost 25 years old, the Nuffield Council on Bioethics. I'll go very quickly through this. You probably, many of you will be familiar with this, but as has been said, we are not a national ethics committee. The UK doesn't have a formal national ethics committee. The council is funded by the Nuffield Foundation, which established it initially, and was soon joined in funding by the Wellcome Trust and the Medical Research Council. So we operate independently of government. We operate independently of our funders, pretty much, as they don't tell us what to look at, and they don't get sight of anything that we say before we publish it. They really do leave us alone. The terms of reference are relatively straightforward, essentially 3 points: to identify those issues arising in biomedical sciences, to anticipate and respond to public concern, to make arrangements for examining them and to promote public discussion and understanding, and then to make reports and recommendations that interestingly, and I think this is the point where, for today's purposes, I think the promoting public discussion and understanding is critical, and we've heard of that from other colleagues today. But here I'm just looking at the importance of focusing on the policy contribution, and that's a contribution that the Nuffield Council makes as a deliberative body, as one that is specifically cross-disciplinary, multidisciplinary, with scientists, medics, philosophers and lawyers, but also cross-sectoral, as we also have people from industry, from the public sphere, and practitioners. And that was so from the outset. Although there were a lot of scientists behind it at the outset, it was very much engaging wider groups of people. So, looking back to the early days, and the first report was on genetic screening, from the outset, I think we can recognize that there was both a more local or national and an international perspective in there. Genetic screening, as the first report, of course, would be addressed and promoted, regulated very much with a local focus, but there was clearly a broader international interest at that time. Other early reports, such as those on genetically modified crops and health-related research in developing countries, plainly had clear international dimensions, even though they might be addressed to the science and the work and the development of research within the UK. It had implications out with the UK. As we went on, we could start to see some of the specific targeting of the policy impact or the influence that we were seeking to have. And there was some discussion earlier about how we select topics and what our intention is. And amongst the criteria that the Council has, and this was reflected earlier about selecting topics, is that we seek for them to be timely, to be relevant to policy and practice, where we can make a unique contribution. And we do hope to do that, and we do promote, we do follow up to seek that some degree of influence. That is not to say that the Council thinks that it has got the last word on a subject, that we necessarily think that we've settled an argument, but rather, and as our former chair used to put it, we don't expect to have the last word, but we may sometimes have the first word on a subject. But rather what we're looking for is probably a timely and useful contribution in order to support better public discourse and better decision-making. Of course, if they simply do what we say, that will be better decision-making, but we can only try. There have been ways in which our work has been demonstrably effective in influencing decision-making. I'll go back to 2006, the report on critical care decisions in early neonatal care. This is intensive care for very premature neonates. And I'm not going to go into the detail of any of these things, but simply to say the recommendations that we arrived at were around the need to provide well-worked guidance in the case of very early neonatal care, and the broad frame of what we recommended was taken up and adapted and published by the Royal College for Paediatric and Child Health. In 2007, we published our report on the forensic use of bioinformation, and amongst the recommendations in there, taking account of concerns for privacy and proportionality, we recommended that the UK government should desist from or the police services, I should say, should desist from retaining samples and genetic profiles of those people who have been arrested but never convicted of a criminal offence. And the European Court on Human Rights quoted the Council's report when it found against the UK government on that very point and forced the UK government to change the law and no longer retain those DNA samples. Our 2007 report on public health, in which we proposed this intervention ladder, as we called it, as a way of finding proportionate ways of intervening in public health circumstances in ways that enabled public health policy to develop with support, with a proportionate response. This has been used in numerous policy documents across the UK, of course in health. Interestingly, we've seen it used in a white paper in transport. We've also exported it to Germany, where we've also seen it in some policy proposals recently as well. So this has been effective not just within the UK, but we do see and hear these used elsewhere. We published the report that we talked in this room about a couple of years ago on novel techniques for the prevention of mitochondrial DNA disorders in 2012. This was very much a targeted contribution to a policy process that was already underway. It had already been underway for a year or two, but it was becoming quite evident that there was a pressure on the UK government to consider putting in place regulations that would allow these therapies to go ahead. And the Council, with a piece of work that was a little quicker than our usual rather lengthy, slow process, published this report specifically to ensure that the ethical aspects of this question were put on the table. They were in the public sphere so that the policy discourse, which was a very wide public debate, and John's referred to it already, so that they were supported by this kind of the discussion that we were able to set out there. So there are ways in which we can usefully, we hope, support policy discussion, assist it, sometimes influence it. I've indicated a number of things that we've done in the past. If we look then ahead to the future, thinking about the theme of this meeting, I wouldn't want to say that the future is markedly different from the past in many respects, but I mean, I've said elsewhere, and the Council has pointed out these several aspects that I think we probably need to be a little more attentive to. First, that issues cross disciplines and they cross sectors. We can't keep health in its own part. So health, the distinction between what is healthcare, what is health promotion, what is health optimization, what is enhancement, starts to get broken down. Those things, if we're talking about bioethics, those things that are purely biological can no longer be contained within a separate box either, as we stand them in relation to or use them in connection with other sciences and technologies in the information sectors, in imaging, etc. That we need to work globally, this is in a sense fairly obvious. But also, and again, something that we've been hearing repeatedly, and I think it's a theme that all of us working in these areas as national ethics councils or elsewhere increasingly recognise of the need for a wider range of voices to be heard, for this discourse to take place in a public space. And this is not just as a way of conducting ethical debate, and we discussed this in some ways in some of our recent reports on emerging biotechnologies. But I think there's also an interesting moment politically, certainly in the UK, which is about contributing to what is often talked about as open policy making. That policymakers are inviting people to participate in a wider range of policy. Well, they've got to, because there's not many of them left. And this is part of the problem, is the diminishing capacity within government and within those supporting government because of the cuts in their own resources, the diminishing capacity themselves. And so some of us, I think, we need to be very careful about getting closer to government, but there's a space there that needs to be filled. And if we're going to do that, we need to make sure that we have, as we've already talked about, bringing to them the right kind of evidence, the right kind of people, the right kind of argumentation, but also to do this with it bearing in mind that it needs to be a public discourse that engages as many people as possible. That is not to say that government wants to listen, and I think increasingly we are fearing that they really don't want to listen, but that's the job. These themes, we've seen them coming through some of our recent reports and the work that we're doing at the moment quite clearly. We published on novel neurotechnologies a few years ago. These are some of the recommendations that we made that we're carrying through with policymakers about trying to establish a register of clinical interventions because these are all isolated interventions, about the need for guidance on sham surgery for research interventions, which is strangely missing. But in particular, looking at a recommendation we made about the need, what we suggest is the need to regulate neurostimulation devices that are used for non-medical purposes, as Laurence referred to a little earlier. Now, to think about that just in a UK context doesn't work, and so our Medicines Agency has taken this and put it on the table at the European Medicines Agency so that it can be considered in the context of the European Medical Devices Directive. So this has to move to an EU level. It cannot move at any other level. We published earlier this year our report on biological and health data, to some extent, or largely about, but not just about, big data initiatives in the context of public health research and other health research. And I think the point here is about how this cannot be contained within a health sector. The data comes from health environments, but it is also increasingly coming from non-health environments, whether it is social media applications, your supermarket loyalty card data. It's the bringing together of these data from across these different sectors that is precisely the challenging question. And not only that it's being brought in from there, also, but it then gets taken out into other sectors so that it can be used, of course, and this is the big potential for important health and public health research, but also potentially for other commercial and marketing purposes. So it's breaching those boundaries. We published very recently on children and clinical research, trying to deal with this conundrum that we're constantly giving children treatments, drugs and therapies that have not been researched adequately in children, and yet we don't want to do research with children. So we're trying to take that question forward. I won't go into the detail, but again, this has simply crossed national boundaries, much more even than we thought it would. We worked internationally, we worked with partners in Kenya in working this up, but we also now find ourselves, having published it, working with partners who are trying to take it elsewhere. We already have gotten translations of our core material into Spanish, and further work is being done on that, and we're talking to other partners and hoping that they will be able to get translations of those materials into Chinese and Arabic. We think if we can just get French and German, we can probably cover 90% of the world. So we'll keep working on that. But it's interesting how rapidly, having just published this is being taken up way beyond our own boundaries. So coming up, we have two specific projects we're working on at the moment. One is on cosmetic procedures. The boundaries are clearly breached here because we are talking about restorative procedures, cosmetic procedures, and enhancement procedures, and all within the same clinics, the same people. And the question for us is those health professionals who are developing, offering, promoting, commercializing these techniques across all of these areas. And genome editing, we've just started work on this, but already, and in a very short time, we see that not just the practice, but the debate around this is already a global debate. Whether it's calling for a moratorium or whether it's calling for freedom to research, already we're into that. And both of these are of real intense and wide public interest. So, just to finish, and I see that we're getting close to the time when we need to go and rest for a little while. The Nuffield Council on Bioethics is not a national ethics commission, but we are UK-based. We're sometimes described as a de facto national ethics commission, and we do participate in the fora of national ethics commissions very usefully from our point of view and hopefully for others. We're not a national ethics committee, but we are UK-based, but we cannot be simply UK-focused. To be exclusively so would actually be to limit and boundary our work in ways that just doesn't fit with the stuff that we're dealing with. So far this year, we have responded, drawing on the work that we've done, we've responded to 11 consultations, policy consultations. 6 of these have been UK-based, 5 of them have been international, whether through international organizations or the US Commission on Bioethics, for example. So we can't avoid this. So in this context, I think we do all benefit from these international exchanges. Many of us have been to them, whether it's the European Commission's NEC Forum, the Global Summit, the intergovernmental organizations themselves. We have several kind of smaller bilateral, trilateral meetings that go on as well. They're not all productive all the time. I won't make that claim. But clearly, we all, Swedish, Danish, German, French, and the rest of us, do still have a role in informing policy, and just as much now as we did 25 or 30 years ago. And in the complex global environment, I don't think that we should feel constrained by borders or by boundaries, and so we can probably, hopefully, continue to inform and learn from each other as we all want to deliver, hopefully, supportive material, discourse and engagement that is supportive to policy processes. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We don't have too much time for discussion, but I know that there are raising hands. First you. Just present yourself in the beginning.
My name is Daniel Tarsus. I was former chair of this august body that we are celebrating today. I would like to thank Laurence Lvov for an excellent presentation of the Oviedo Convention. She did not very politely mention one shameful fact, which I would like to bring up, and that's the fact that Sweden has not, after 18 years, ratified this convention. Sweden signed it 18 years ago, but 18 years of mature reflection in the government office has not yet resulted in any Swedish ratification, in spite of gentle reminders from SMER from time to time that this would be a very wise step. And I think SMER has a mission there to continue harassing the government on this matter. The reason why Sweden hasn't ratified it is a particular defect in Swedish legislation that Elisabeth Rynung has the great merit of having explained very, very extensively in a number of works. A lack of regulation for incapacitated patients in healthcare. But this is something that can be remedied, and the Swedish government should, again, be ashamed of itself, and SMER should remind the government and parliament that this is still waiting. Thank you.
Can I just say, if I may, you may be aware, maybe not, that the UK government has not signed or ratified the convention. I am not here to speak on behalf of the UK government. There was a time when I could do that, but I probably would never happen again. So if I'm a little bit indiscreet, I will simply say that there are reasons, I think, why the UK government hasn't signed and ratified. I think when they explain themselves, there is always a lack of clarity about their reasoning.
There are more sinners in the room. 29 countries, if I don't count it, have ratified the convention. And also all the additional protocols, you cannot ratify if you haven't ratified the convention. So there are a number of things we have not done.
It's difficult for me to be the devil's advocate, but I would like to stress that the influence of the work done at intergovernmental level, I'm not talking about Council of Europe as a body, but at intergovernmental level, on legislation and practices, as I said, can be reflected also in countries that are not even signatory. And that doesn't mean that ratification is not necessary. I want to insist on that, because it's still a commitment at international level. It's interesting to see that a lot of countries that have not ratified are actually enacting the same principles in their own legislation. So it's the motivation for a country to commit themselves at international level may be motivated by different reasons. Some countries are actually doing that to provide a basis for their own national legislations, and that is true also towards Eastern Europe in particular. That was the evolution. I think for others who have already reached those standards, and sometimes are even getting further than that, I think it's an acknowledgement at international level of the value of this. It's a commitment, and that is a political sign, I would say. And that is true for a certain number of countries. Again, it's not because they are not implementing the principle, it's just because maybe they don't feel that it's necessary because they are already at that level. But I think that the evolution in that field makes this political sign quite important.
Yeah, up there.
Jochen Taupitz from Germany. I also would like to address the Oviedo Convention, and I would like to ask you, Laurence, what about the strategy concerning the different instruments, recommendations versus protocols. As we all know, the protocols only can be changed, revised in consensus of all member states, but a recommendation can be changed, revised much easier. What is the strategy? Because I fear always that protocols and the Oviedo Convention can lead to a fossilization of law. If it can't be changed, or it can be changed.
The rule are two-thirds majority. So it's not the majority required for a legally binding instrument. However, in practice, the way it works, it's trying to get a consensus without having emptiness in the provision. So, I mean, that is the way of working, but the rules is not the unanimity. It's a two-thirds majority.
Yes,
but it rarely reached that point. Well, the last protocol on genetics, which is still not entering into force, even though it was adopted, in that case, unanimously at the Committee of Ministers level. So I think the rules are slightly different. And it's true also that if you are elaborating a legally binding instrument, it takes a certain time to be enforced. And if the value of this principle will be obsolete within a couple of years, then all the investments to enforce that will be kind of lost. So there is a balance to be struck on this. Just to give you an example of a recent re-examination of a protocol, which is a protocol on transplantation. It ended up not being modified, but there was some additional clarifications provided in the explanatory report. And we are back to this implementation issue I was actually raising as a focus. So it's not necessarily questioning the principle, but trying to clarify it in the light of the current context, how this is to be implemented, and that's what happened. So it's not changing the protocol, but it's still adapting to the evolution as well.
John Harris.
I'm sorry, I hate to enter a discordant note, particularly in the presence of Laurence, but I would like to congratulate the UK government and the Swedish government on not ratifying these treaties. Why? Because there are things in them that are unacceptable, it seems to me, and possibly unethical. But it raises another issue, and that is that there is a great tendency for something like the Oviedo Convention or any of these other things to act as a substitute for people thinking for themselves. That it's against this convention, it's against this international protocol, so that's the end of it. Well, I don't think it should be the end of it. I think we constantly need to rethink our stances on moral issues, both as individuals and as societies. Mm-hmm. And mechanisms that create consensus, not by, so to speak, attempting to have people think about the detail and the consequences of everything in it, but simply to join the club to prove that you're civilized is a very bad idea. And I think there is a tendency to measure the ethical responsibilities of a nation by whether they've signed up to these protocols or not. And I think that is no accurate measure of the ethics of particular societies. There is a lot of diversity in Europe. I don't want to go into the individual provisions of these conventions, but there is a lot of healthy diversity in Europe. Some countries permit stem cell research on embryos, others do not. I don't think these signal a difference, so to speak, in the moral consciousness of these countries. I'm very fond of saying that I drive through Europe to Italy 3 or 4 times a year. I pass through Belgium, France, Luxembourg, Switzerland, and Italy and Germany. These countries have very different laws on very crucial moral issues. But I don't feel I'm entering a different moral environment, an unacceptable moral environment, when I pass through a country that I happen to disagree with on particular issues. I don't think that I better watch my back because I'm entering Switzerland that permits euthanasia, or when I'm entering Italy that has chaos everywhere, or when we actually, I think, live in a relatively homogeneous moral community here in Greater Europe, covered by the Council of Europe. And I don't think, I think making people sign up to uniformity is not a good way of encouraging the harmony in the great European community.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
Well, this is certainly a view. What I think is that the way it's presented is a top-down thing that is actually imposed on people. Whereas to me, a legislative process being at national or international level is the outcome of a democratic process. So it's not something that is imposed on people, that is something that is the result of a discussion that took place at national and international level. The objective was not to impose strict rules, but to define minimum standards that would safeguard those values on which there was an agreement in Europe. There is a lot of flexibility in this. I think the Court of Human Rights is actually showing that flexibility. And if you look at the way bioethical issues are addressed, there's a lot of margin of maneuver left to the states. So you could disagree on this. I have no problem. I just think that the way it is presented is slightly incorrect in the sense that it's not a top-down process. I think this is important to remind.
If the UK government were to consider ratifying this, they would do so, there would be a detailed national discussion of all the provisions, and that's the problem. It would be a package, take it or leave it.
But that would be interesting, that would promote a discussion as well. Yeah. I'm just being a little bit cynical on this. But no, I just honestly think that you could say it may be theoretical, but it's a reality. And it was not an easy job to reach that level of agreement. So it's not as if something was imposed by an ivory tower on the citizens. It was an achievement of a long discussion.
It's not only a view, but it's a fundamentally erroneous view. What has happened in Europe when the Council of Europe was enlarged was that a number of countries with absolutely medieval legislation were stimulated into accepting civil, decent rules. The abolition of the death penalty came about just because these countries wanted to join the Council of Europe. They were forced, they were compelled to ratify the European Convention plus protocols. So a number of legal reforms in Eastern Europe happened only because these countries were actually compelled to prove that they were European. So this is an extremely positive pressure applied on states. Yes, top down. A very, very, very decent, civilized and civilizing pressure applied on countries which had absolutely medieval legislation.
Thank you.
Not Sweden or the UK.
Okay, you can.
I maybe I can assist by diverting this. I think this is missing the point in a way of the subtlety of some of the issues that we're managing today, and the symposium at which the Council of Europe started to look at the questions of emerging biotechnologies and converging technologies, raised this question of how we manage things that are increasingly complex, breaching category boundaries. And certainly in the recent work that we have carried out, what we're finding is it is increasingly difficult, and this is not to make a comment on that code or any other code, but it's quite difficult to frame things with specificity, but rather because people are working in very dynamic environments, in complex environments with multiple political, economic, moral, sociological factors bound into them, that I think what we're having to do now as part of our work is to put people in a position where they can manage situations that are going to keep changing and where they can have the tools available to do that. So I think that to some extent I would rather that we put the discussion into a different place and recognized that complexity and subtlety of people's responses, which is precisely about the ethics of managing difficult situations.
Okay, Shibon, you have the last comment. Hope it is short.
I have one quick question for Hugh and for Abba. The first one, Hugh, is you mentioned that the role of ethics councils is to bring the right people and the right arguments to government's attention.
Did I say that?
You did. So I'm fascinated to know who the right people are, what the right arguments are, and how one finds them, and who makes these decisions.
Where's Lotte? Lotte had the answer. She had the answer earlier. She said, it depends.
And at this time of the evening, I'll let you away with that. And Abba, just you mentioned with the Ebola crisis, some of the work that was done. And I think it's interesting around some of the ethical consultation that was done around experimental drugs in the Ebola crisis. And I wonder, you seem to be quite satisfied with the process and said, in fact, this could be an exemplar for how we do it in the future. And I think there was a certain amount of commentary about that process in the public domain, that it in fact wasn't, let's say, ideal. And that one thing that struck me at the time was when the opinion of the ethics group was published, it was very short. There was no underlying rationale for why they had come to this consensus. And in fact, we were told this would follow at a later point. I'm still trying to find it. And I think there is a real onus on WHO because of, if you make those kind of pronouncements, that was a particular issue that wasn't just relevant for Ebola, but for a whole swathe of other diseases. And I just wonder if you really think that that is an exemplar going forward, or whether perhaps, as Jean-Claude said earlier, that we don't or we shouldn't respond to these kind of things either with enthusiasm or in an emergency, that maybe there was a more qualified way to do that.
So as Hugh said, well, did I say that? No, on a more serious note, I think the exemplar I was talking about was the fact that ethics discourse was accompanying the research activity. So the research could have happened, the researchers could have taken things in their own hands and done that in any case. But they were coming back to the bioethicists and saying, we need some guidance. The problem was that there was an urgency, that there was not enough time, and that's what I was mentioning, that because of lack of time, the deliberative processes can be faulty, can be too rapid, and may not be enough deliberative. And therefore, some of these deliberations actually need to be made in preparation for the next epidemic and not at times of crises. But when crisis happens and it's on your doorstep, you have to do something. And I think that's where we were at the time in August 2014. There was a crisis and there was this huge, as the world saw it, a huge disparity of developed countries or citizens of developed countries getting experimental drugs and actually perhaps benefiting from them, and the citizens of the countries which were affected, including the physicians who were affected by the disease, not even being able to access any of those so-called therapeutic interventions. And that's where this whole debate arose, and there needed to be some sort of guidance. It was not the best guidance in the sense that, as you said, the process was not well explained, the rationale was not well explained, but it happened. I think one could say that because of the urgency, some of the things were missing. But nobody actually questioned, if you go back to all the arguments that you were saying, the criticism in the press, no one actually questioned that the final outcome was wrong. They questioned whether the panel was was the right panel, or how were people selected for that panel. But nobody has said that the outcome was wrong. There were things missing in there, like there could be more, it could be more comprehensive. But I still have to see an argument which said this was the wrong decision made by WHO. In principle, people did agree that that was the right decision. So I'd be happy for you to show me where people said it was a wrong decision. The process, one can go this way or one can go another way. And yes, you're right, some of the things that were said at that time needs better explanation and more, let's say, more deliberation on that. And I think that's where we need to work more in this area. So you're correct on that.
Yeah, so when you are expecting the next epidemic, so then you can prepare principles for such kind of situations. Thank you very much for the presentations. Thank you for discussions. And I think we need some information about the dinner and boat trip. Jill or Lotta? Thank you.